course, it's deserted.
If you haven't found her in 24 hours, there'll be nothing left to find.
Beyond the edge of the known world lies a legend no one was meant to find. Welcome back to M Cinema Reviews. Today we journey into King Kong 2005, where beauty meets the beast and a mysterious island awakens a force beyond imagination. Get ready because some legends do not stay hidden forever. King Kong 2005 is an epic monster adventure film directed, co-written, and produced by Peter Jackson. It serves as the ninth installment in the King Kong franchise and is the second remake of the original 1933 classic, following the 1976 version. The film features a strong ensemble cast including Naomi Watts, Jack Black, Adrien Brody, and Andy Serkis, who delivers a groundbreaking motion capture performance as Kong. Set in 1933, the story follows an ambitious but manipulative filmmaker who deceives his cast and crew into traveling to the mysterious Skull Island. There, they encounter terrifying prehistoric creature and a colossal gorilla named Kong. After capturing him, they transport Kong to New York City, leading to tragic consequences. The project was first developed in the mid 1990s when Universal Pictures approached Jackson. However, production was delayed as similar monster films were being developed, and Jackson shifted focus to the Lord of Rings trilogy. Following the massive success of those films, the project was revived in 2003. Filming took place in New Zealand between September 2004 and March 2005, with a budget that grew to approximately $207 million. King Kong became the most expensive film ever made at the time of its release. It premiered in New York City on December 5, 2005. Before its worldwide release later that month, the film received widespread critical acclaim, particularly for its visual effects, performances, and epic scale, though some critics noted its lengthy runtime. It was also a major box office success, earning over $557 million worldwide. Additionally, it won three Academy Awards for the Best Sound Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Visual Effects, further cementing its legacy as one of the standout films of its time. In King Kong, a desperate filmmaker chasing fame unknowingly unleashes a tragedy the world will never forget. Set during the Great Depression, the story follows Ann Darrow, a struggling performer who joins a mysterious expedition led by ambitious Carl Denham, only to discover a hidden island filled with terrifying creatures and one unforgettable legend. Deep within Skull Island lives Kong, a massive, fearsome ape, but not in the mindless beast everyone expects. When Anne is taken as a sacrifice, something unexpected happens. Kong does not destroy her, he connects with her. What begins as a fear slowly turns into an emotional bond that changes everything. But greed always finds a way. Driven by obsession, Denham captures Kong and drags him to New York, turning him into a spectacle for the world. Chains can hold his body, but not his rage. When Kong breaks free, the city becomes his battlefield, and his only goal is to find the one person who showed him kindness. An. The final climb to the top of Empire State Building is not just a fight for survival, it is a heartbreaking end to a misunderstood soul. Introduction. The making of a dream cast when director Peter Jackson set out to remake the 1933 classic King Kong in 2005. He was not simply retelling a beloved monster story. He was embarking on what many would describe as a cinematic love letter, a deeply personal project rooted in childhood wonder and an adult filmmaker's mastery of craft. But no vision, however vivid, can succeed without the right ensemble to bring it to life. The casting of King Kong 2005 was, in many respects, as momentous and as carefully considered as any other element of the production. Peter Jackson had first seen the King Kong at the age of 9, reduced to tears as Kong fell from the Empire State Building. As a 12-year-old, he attempted to recreate the film using his parents' Super 8 camera and a model of Kong made from the wire, rubber, and his mother's coat fur. The 1933 film had not merely entertained him, it had defined him. Decades later, when the global triumph of the Lord of Rings trilogy behind him, Jackson finally had both the technology and the studio backing to realize his dream with full fidelity. The film, released on December 14, 2005, boasted a final budget of approximately $207 million, making it one of the most expensive productions in the cinema history at that time. It starred Naomi Watts, Jack Black, Adrien Brody, Thomas Kretschmann, Colin Hanks, Jamie Bell, Kyle Chandler, Ivan Parke, and Andy Serkis, alongside a vast supporting ensemble. Together, these performers, many of them acclaimed actors in their own right, were asked to anchor a story that was equal parts action spectacle, depression era period drama, and deeply felt romantic tragedy. This video explores the casting of King Kong 2005 in comprehensive detail: who was chosen, why they were chosen, and what they brought to their roles, and how the assembled ensemble shaped one of the most ambitious blockbusters of the early 21st century. From Naomi Watts' luminous portrayal of Anne Darrow to Andy Serkis' groundbreaking motion capture performance, as Kong himself. Each casting decision contributed to a film that earned not only significant box office return but also three Academy Awards and an enduring reputation as a landmark of modern cinema. Development and history and early casting consideration. The story of King Kong 2005 came to be cast is inseparable from the story of how the film itself came to be made. Universal Pictures first approached Jackson to direct the remake in early 1995, shortly after the global success of Heavenly Creatures had established him as a filmmaker of serious artistic ambition. Pre-production commenced with a real enthusiasm, and a script began to take shape. In the mid-1990s iteration of the project, Jackson's casting vision was quite different from what audience eventually saw in 2005. For the role of Ann Darrow, Jackson famously flew in 1996 to the Mexico set of James Cameron's Titanic to discuss the part with Kate Winslet, with whom he had previously collaborated on Heavenly Creatures. Winslet was reportedly under strong consideration, while actress Minnie Driver was also mentioned in the connection with the role. For the male leads, Jackson's early choices were set to include George Clooney for the role of Jack Driscoll and the Robert De Niro for Carl Denham. It is fascinating to imagine a version of King Kong built around those performers. It would have been a radically different film in the tone and character. The project stalled in early 1997. Several ape and giant monster related films were in various stages of development at Hollywood studios simultaneously, and Universal grew wary of the market saturation. Jackson himself pivoted to The Lord of the Rings, a decision that would transform his career and reshape the popular cinema entirely. King Kong was placed on hold, where it remained for years. It was only after the completion of The Return of King in 2003 and the enormous critical and commercial validation that trilogy provided that Jackson was finally in a position to revisit his childhood obsession on his own terms. Universal approved a new script with Robert Zemeckis serving as an executive producer. Jackson, along with co-writers Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, began drafting a new screenplay in late October 2003, deliberately choosing to base it on the 1933 original rather than the abandoned 1996 draft. Their new version was finished in February 2004, and principal photography began on September 6 of the year at the Camperdown Studio in Miramar, New Zealand. The casting for this new iteration was handled with considerable care. Jackson brought with him most of the core creative team from the Lord of Rings trilogy, and his instinct was to populate the King Kong with the actors who could deliver authentic emotional performances rather than relying solely on a star power. He wanted performers capable of holding their own against the film's extraordinary visual effects and against Kong himself. Naomi Watts as Ann Darrow, the soul of the film. Of all the casting decisions made for King Kong 2005, perhaps none was more consequential or more unanimously applauded than the selection of Naomi Watts to play Ann Darrow. The role of Anne is, in many ways, the most demanding in the film. She must be simultaneously vulnerable and resilient, fearful and curious, a performer and a genuine human being capable of forming an unexpected emotional bond with a creature utterly unlike herself. The success or failure of King Kong as an emotional experience rests almost entirely on whether audiences believe in Anne and whether they believe in her relationship with Kong. Naomi Watts was born in Shoreham by Sea, England, in 1968 and had spent years working in Australian and American film and television before her international breakthrough. The breakthrough came with David Lynch's 2001 psychological thriller Mulholland Drive, in which she delivered a stunning dual performance that won worldwide critical acclaim and established her as one of the most gifted actresses of her generation. Further high-profile work in The Ring (2002) and 21 Gram (2003), which earned her an Academy Award nomination, cemented her status. Jackson recognized in Watts an actress of extraordinary emotional range and physical expressiveness, qualities that would be absolute essential in a role requiring her to act against a creature that did not actually exist on the set. The emotional scenes between Anne and Kong were filmed with Watts performing alongside nothing more than reference markers, with Andy Serkis occasionally providing an eyeline from a cherry picker to help orient her performance. The challenge of conveying genuine feeling in such technically artificial circumstances is immense, and Watts met it with remarkable success. In preparation for the role, Watts undertook thoughtful research. Most movingly, she met with Faye Ware, the actress who had originated the role of Ann Darrow in 1933 film. Jackson had hoped to offer Ware a cameo appearance in the remake, specifically to deliver the film's full line of dialogue, but Ware passed away during the pre-production at the age of 96 in August 2004. The intended tribute became a memorial instead. Watts also drew on the memorial "Early Howick", written by vaudeville performer June Howick, which Jackson had optioned to help Wallace and Boynes flesh out Anne's backstory as a Depression-era entertainer. This research gave Watts a grounded, historically informed understanding of who Anne Darrow was as a woman before the extraordinary event of the story overtook her. In the film, Anne Darrow is described as a struggling vaudeville actress in Depression-era New York City, desperate for work and on the verge of accepting employment in a burlesque theater when Carl Denham intercedes. She is brave, compassionate, and possessed of a sharp wit. Her relationship with Kong, complex, tender, and ultimately tragic, elevates what could have been simple damsel in distress narrative into something genuinely affecting. Watts bring warmth, intelligence, and a striking physicality to the role, making Anne feel like a fully realized human being rather than a passive victim. Critical reception to Watts' performance was overwhelmingly positive. Reviewers praised her ability to give the film its emotional core, with one noted critic calling her portrayal one of the most impressive examples of acting against an imaginary co-star even committed to film. The physical demand for the role were also considerable. Watts endured sequences requiring her to be thrown, shaken, and suspended at great heights, often performing these scenes without her digital co-star present. Her commitment to the role was total and it shows in every frame. Jack Black as Carl Denham, the showman and the villain. The role of Carl Denham, the ambitious, self serving filmmaker who sets the entire catastrophe in motion, is one of the most fascinating and complex in King Kong 2005. Denham is not a straightforward villain. He is charming, visionary, and genuinely passionate about his art. He is also reckless, morally compromised, and ultimately responsible for the Kong's death. Playing such a figure requires an actor capable of embodying both charisma and darkness, someone the audience can simultaneously enjoy and condemn. Jackson's choice of Jack Black for the role was inspired, though it surprised some observers at the time. Black was known primarily as a comedic performer and musician, the frontman of the comedy rock duo Tenacious D and a scene-stealing presence in films such as High Fidelity 2000 and The School of Rock 2003. It was specifically Black's performance in High Fidelity that had caught Jackson's attention and convinced him that the actor had the depth and energy to anchor characters as large and contradictory as Denham. In preparing for the role, Black undertook extensive research into the historical and cultural touchstones that Denham was meant to embody. The character was deliberately modeled after Orson Welles, the brilliant, bombastic, self aggrandizing wonderkind of American entertainment. Jackson and his writers had called Denham embody Wells' particular brand of artistic megalomania, his willingness to deceive and manipulate in service of his vision, and his genuine for self-promotion. Black also studied P.T. Barnum, the great American showman, whose career was built on exploitation of spectacle and manufacturing of wonders. Black's approach to the role was characteristically energetic but disciplined in a way that surprised many critics. He captured Denham's infectious enthusiasm for filmmaking while never allowing the audience to entirely forget the man's fundamental selfishness. The scene in which Denham, standing amid the carnage Kong has wrought in New York, delivers the film's finale line, attributing Kong's death to beauty having killed the beast, is a masterclass in ambiguity. Black plays it straight without irony, and the effect is chilling. Here is a man who has caused untold suffering and is already mentally reframing it as art. Some critics felt that Black was slightly miscast, arguing that his inherent likability made it difficult to fully condemn Denham. Others, however, maintained that this was precisely the point. The more obviously villainous the actor would have made Denham too easily to dismiss, whereas Black kept the character uncomfortably appealing even as his actions grew more monstrous. Whatever one's view, Black's committed, energetic performance is one of the defining elements of the film's first act. Adrien Brody as Jack Driscoll, the reluctant hero. Adrien Brody was cast as Jack Driscoll, though the character underwent significant transformation from his counterpart in the 1933 original. In the classic film, Jack Driscoll was rugged, first mate aboard the Venture, the salt of the earth's adventure type. Jackson and his co-writers made the interesting choice to reimagine Driscoll as a playwright, a man of letters rather than a man of action. This shift gave the character a different kind of vulnerability. He is sensitive, observant, somewhat bookish individual who finds himself in circumstances utterly outside of his experience. Adrien Brody had won the Academy Award for Best Actor just 2 years before King Kong's production commenced for his devastating performance in Polanski, The Pianist 2002. He was, by any measure, the one of the most respected dramatic actor of his generation. His casting in King Kong was seen by many as indirect indicator of the Jacksons' ambition to elevate the material above the level of typical blockbuster entertainment. Brody brought seriousness and genuine emotional investment to a role that lesser production might have filled with a straightforward action hero. In the film, Driscoll begins as a reluctant participant in the Denham's expedition. He boards the venture merely to deliver a script and finds himself unable to leave before the ship departs. His romance with Anne developed during the voyage, and when she is taken by Kong on the Skull Island, Driscoll leads the mission to rescue her. Brody plays the hero's journey with a certain gangly determination that is rather charming. This is not a man who was born to save the day, but the one who rises to occasion because he has no other acceptable choice. Brody's chemistry with Watts is a warm and believable, and their scenes together provide a humanizing counterweight to the film's more spectacular sequence. The moment in which Driscoll professes his feeling for Anne through an awkward conversation about subtext that became a running joke is one of the film's most endearing. Brody plays it with a self descripting intelligence that suggests Driscoll knows exactly how inadequate his emotional vocabulary is, even as he struggles to overcome it. Andy Serkis as Kong and Lumpy, the art of motion capture. Of all the performances in King Kong 2005, perhaps none was more technically innovative or more creatively extraordinary than Andy Serkis' dual turn as both the ship's cook, Lumpy, and through the medium of motion capture as Kong himself. The casting of Serkis in the title role was announced in April 2003 and was widely understood as a direct expression of Jackson's faith in the motion capture process he had helped pioneer with Colin in the Lord of Rings trilogy. Andrew Clement Serkis was born on April 20, 1964, in Ruislip Manor, West London. His father, Clement Serkis, was a medical doctor of American heritage, and the family spent much of Andy's early childhood moving between Baghdad and London. After training at the Victoria University of Manchester, Serkis established himself as a respected stage and screen actor before his career was transformed by his collaboration with Jackson on The Lord of the Rings. His performance as Gollum, achieved through an unprecedented combination of physical acting, voice work, and digital transformation, is widely considered one of the great acting achievements of the early 21st century. First, for the King Kong, Serkis faced a challenge in some ways even more daunting than Gollum. Kong is not a human being rendered monstrous. He is an animal with an animal non-verbal expressiveness and an animal's emotional life. Jackson was empathetic from the earliest stages of the production that he did not want Kong to behave like a human. He wanted a gorilla, but a gorilla of mythic scale and interior depth. To achieve this, Serkis immersed himself in the study of gorilla behavior with a dedication broadening on the obsessive. Serkis began by working directly with gorillas at the London Zoo, observing their movement, their social dynamics, and their facial expressions at close quarters. He then traveled to Rwanda, where he spent time in the wild observing gorillas in their natural habitat, an experience he described as profoundly transformative. The specific physical grammar of the gorilla movement, the weight distribution, the use of knuckles for locomotion, the characteristic way a silverback holds its shoulder, became the foundation of his performance. The technical process by which Serkis's performance was captured and translated into the digital Kong was extraordinarily complex. During principal photography, he wore a motion capture suit with 135 small markers attached to his face alone. In addition to the markers on his body, this required him to go through 2 hours of preparation every morning before shooting could begin. Following the completion of principal photography, Serkis then spent an additional 2 months on dedicated motion capture stage, repeating Kong's movement and expression for the digital animator at Weta Digital. The creative insight that made Kong work as character as was the decision to exploit the visual similarities between gorilla and human facial structure. As Vector Digital Christine River explained, gorillas have sufficiently human-looking eyes and brows that human viewers naturally transpose their own emotional interpretation onto gorilla expression. By capturing the nuisance of Serkis' performance, his eyes, his brows, the stubble shift in his expressions, the animators were able to create a Kong whose inner life felt legible and genuine. In parallel with his motion capture work, Serkis also appeared in the film in human form, playing Lumpy, the SS Venture cook, barber, and surgeon. Lumpy is a gruff, good natured sailor who serves as one of the Denham's most loyal crew members. He is killed during the harrowing insect pit sequence on Skull Island, a death that registers with genuine horror because Serkis had made him such a vivid, likable presence. The decision to cast Serkis is a live action role as well as part of Jackson's ongoing commitment to the honoring of actors' complete contribution to the film. The question was of whether Serkis's performance as Kong constitutes acting in the traditional sense was widely debated at the time of the film's release and has remained a touchstone for broader discussion about what motion capture and performance are. What is beyond dispute is that King Kong works emotionally to the degree that it does because of Serkis's extraordinary investment in the role. Kong is, by any measure, one of the most fully realized non-human characters in the history of cinema. Thomas Kretschmann as Captain Englehorn, authority and unease. The German actor Thomas Kretschmann was cast as English Captain Englehorn, the pragmatic and fundamentally decent commander of the SS Venture. Englehorn, in many ways, the more central of the ship's view. A man who operates outside the law, it is implied that he engages in various shady enterprises, but who retains as a core or professional integrity and genuine concern for the lives in his charge. He shows visible dislike for Denham's reckless arrogance from their past meeting, and as events on Skull Island spiral out of control, it is Englehorn who organizes the practical response. Kretschmann was born in Dessau, early Germany in 1962 and trained as a professional swimmer before turning to acting. He has established himself as a significant presence in both European and American cinema, with the notable roles in Roman Polanski The Pianist, the very film for which Adrien Brody won his Oscar, as well as Stalingrad and numerous other productions. His physical authority and quiet intensity made him an ideal choice for a character who must project completeness and reliability under extreme pressure. In the film, Englehorn's arc is interestingly precisely because he is not a hero in the conventional sense. He is manipulated into the voyage by Denham's deception and his initial attempts to deliver the ship to Rangoon. When a radio message informs him there is a warrant for Denham's arrest, are thwarted by the fog that drives the Venture onto the rock of Skull Island. Kretschmann plays the characters going exasperation and eventual pragmatic adaptation with understated skill, ensuring that Englehorn feels like a fully realized individual rather than a functional plot device. Colin Hanks as Preston. Conscience and complexity. Colin Hanks was cast as Preston, Carl Denham's personal assistant, a young man who is honest, fundamentally decent, and increasingly uncomfortable with the moral compromises his employer requires of him. Preston serves as a crucial narrative function. He is the audience's proxy within Denham's immediate circle, The character whose growing unease mirrors the viewer's own discomfort with the filmmaker's escalating recklessness. Colin Hanks was born in Sacramento, California in 1977, the son of legendary actor Tom Hanks and his first wife Samantha Lewis. He had worked steadily in the film and television throughout the early 2000s, with the notable roles in the Orange County 2002, which interestingly featured Jack Black, and the television series Roswell. His casting in the King Kong brought him into the one of the most prestigious productions of his career to that point, and he brought a genuine warmth and moral clarity to what could have been fairly peripheral role. Preston's most important dramatic function is to serve a foil for Denham. His repeated attempts to question his boss's decision highlights just how far outside the bound of normal behavior Denham is willing to go. Hank plays this dynamic with a nicely calibrated mixture of loyalty, anxiety, and suppressed moral outrage, never tipping over into the either blind differences or self-righteous condemnation. Jamie Bell as Jimmy, youth and wonder on Skull Island. Jamie Bell brought a striking intensity to the role of Jimmy, a young teenager of mysterious origins who has been living wild abroad the winter. Jimmy is a kleptomaniac with a troubled past who has attached himself to Hayes, the ship's first mate and one of the film's most compelling figures, as a surrogate father. His arc through the film is one of the painful coming of age. The brutal violence of the Skull Island strips away whatever remained of his innocence and forces a confrontation with the reality that his youth makes all the more wrenching. Jamie Bell was born in 1986 in Billingham, County Durham, England. He came from a family with deep roots in dance. His grandmother, mother, aunt, and sister were all dancers, and his own story bore remarkable parallels to his breakthrough role as Billy Elliot 2000s, the film in which he played a working class boy who secretly aspires to become a ballet dancer. Just as a character in the film has kept his dancing a secret from his friends, Bell himself had grown up concealing his interest in dance from his peers. The film made him a star at the age of 13. By the time of King Kong, Bell was still a teenager but had already established himself as an actor of considerable range and emotional depth. His performance as Jimmy is raw and unguarded in the way that feels entirely authentic, particularly in his scenes with Evan Park's Highs, where the two actors achieve a genuine warmth and tenderness that makes High's eventual death all the more devastating. In the extended edition of the film, Jimmy's farewell to Hayes is shown in fuller detail, adding additional emotional weight to their relationship. Bell's casting was an example of Jackson's preference for authenticity over star power in the supporting role. Jimmy is not a glamorous or conventionally heroic character, but he is one of the film's most emotionally resonant presence, and Bell's committed performance is a significant part of the reason why. Evan Park as Hayes, dignity, leadership, and a loss. Evan Park delivered one of the film's most quietly powerful performances as Benjamin Hayes, Captain Englehorn's first mate. Hayes is a World War I veteran whose military training makes him the natural leader of the rescue mission into the Skulls Island jungle, and his mentorship of the young Jimmy forms one of the film's most affecting emotional through lines. He is a man of measured authority, a genuine compassion, qualities that stand in marked contrast to Denham's self serving recklessness. Ivan Park was born in Jamaica and received his education at some of the America's most distinguished academic institutions, holding a Bachelor's of Art in Economics from Cornell University as well as both as MFA. and a Master's of Divinity from Yale University. He had been active in film and television for several years before the King Kong, with the roles in films including Cast Away and The Manchurian Candidate. His intellectual background and physical presence made him ideal for a character who needed to project both warrior competence and moral depth. Hai's death is one of the King Kong's most genuinely shocking moments. During the infamous log sequence, in which Kong shakes the rescue party off a log bridge over a chasm, Hayes is hurled against a rock wall and killed. The sudden violence of his end, combined with the emotional investment the film had cultivated in his relationship with Jimmy, hits with a real force. Parke makes Hayes so fully present and alive in every scene he occupies that his absence is immediately and painfully felt. Kyle Chandler as Bruce Baxter. Hollywood artifice on a prehistoric island. Kyle Chandler was cast as a Bruce Baxter, a fictional Hollywood adventure actor who has been hired by Denham as a male lead of his film. Baxter is beautifully convinced, secretional figure, all surface charm and manufactured heroism, whose real character is revealed as a distinctly less impressive when genuine danger arrives. He abandons the search party on Skull Island when things become truly dangerous, only to redeem himself partially by persuading Englehorns to mount a rescue of the party from the insect pit. Kyle Chandler was born in Buffalo, New York in 1965 and had built a reputation as a solid and dependable character actor before King Kong. He would later go on Emmy-winning fame as Scotch Eric Tyler in the television drama Friday Night Lights 2006 to 2011, one of the most beloved performances in American television of the 2000s. In King Kong, he developed his natural authority and charisma in service of a character who is essentially walking comment on the gap between the screen heroism and actual courage. The role of Bruce Baxter is not large but is richly enjoyable one. Chandler plays the character's carefully maintained persona of swaggering confidence with the evident relish, and the scenes in which that persona cracks and genuinely funny. Baxter is ultimately given credit back in New York for rescuing Anne during a Broadway presentation of Kong, a piece of reputational theft that he seems to accept without any visible discomfort. Chandler's easy charm makes Baxter lovably referenceable rather than simply contemptible. The supporting ensemble, building of the world of the King Kong, Lobo Chan as Choi. Lobo Chan played Choi, Lumpy's devoted best friend and venture janitor. Chan's warm, gentle presence makes Choi one of the film's most immediately likable minor characters. His friendship with Lumpy is one of the several small human relationships the film uses to ground its enormous spectacle in recognizable emotional reality. Chan's subsequent film career included roles in Johnny English Reborn 2011 and The Broken 2008, among others. John Sumner as Herb and Craig Hall as Mike John Sumner. John Sumner and Craig Hall played Herb and Mike respectively, Denham's cameraman and soundman. These characters represent the working craftsmen of the film industry, loyal, professional, and ultimately expendable in their employer's calculation. Both actors being genuine presence to the role that the script does not particularly develop, and their fates on the Skull Island register as a human losses rather than mere plot machine. Mechanics. Hall, a New Zealand actor who appeared in numerous other productions throughout his career, was particularly effective in communicating Mike's growing horror at the situation Denham has placed them all in. Mark Hadlow as Harry and Geraldine Borfi as Maud. Mark Hadlow and Geraldine Borfi played Harry and Maud, vaudeville performers who share Anne's theatrical world at the film's opening. Hadlaw, who would go on to appear in Peter Jackson's The Hobbit trilogy as Dory, brought the grounded authenticity to the vaudeville sequences, helping to establish the texture of Depression era New York entertainment. Borges Mud provides a glimpse of the career trajectory that Anne is desperately trying to avoid. Older, less glamorous, still working but with diminished prospects. William Johnson's as Manny. William Johnson played Manny, Anne Darrow's elderly vaudeville colleague and stage partner. Manny is a small but important character. It is who encourages Anne to audition for the play she has been eyeing, setting in motion the chain of events that leads to her encounter with Denham. Johnson played the Manny with an affecting mixture of warmth and world weariness, suggesting a man who has spent decades navigating the vicissitudes of the entertainment industry and emerged with his goodwill intact. David Pitu as Weston. David Pitu appeared as Weston, a theatre producer who has already cast and other actresses in the role of Anne was hoping to audition for, redirecting her toward a burlesque theatre out of pity. It is a small part but pivotal one. Weston's casual dismissal of Anne is a final indignity that leaves her vulnerable to Denham's pitch. Pitt played the character with a precisely calibrated theatrical snobbery that makes his condensness feel utterly authentic. Pip Machine as Zalman and Kim Knockblack as the thuggish executive. Pip Mushin played Zellman, one of the studio figure Denham's orbit, while Jim Knockblack appeared as the thuggish executive. Both roles contributed to the film's satirical portrait of the film industry. Its financier, the power broker concerned primarily with the bottom line rather than artistic integrity. These characters provide important context for the understanding Denham's desperate improvisation. He is not simply a romantic visionary but a man running from financial and professional ruin. Tyrell Mora as the fruit vendor. Australian actor Tyrell Mora appeared in the brief but memorable role of fruit vendor whose apples and Darrow attempt to steal in the opening New York sequences. This moment, the precise point at which Anna's desperate situation leads to her theft and at which Denham intervenes to rescue her, is the inciting incident that sets the entire story in motion. Mora played the role with the gruff indication that gives the scene a nicely comic quality without undermining for underlying pathos. Jed Brophy as the venture crew. Jed Brophy, a long-time Jackson's collaborator who had appeared in various roles throughout the Lord of the Rings trilogy, was among the actors playing members of the Venture's crew. A large ensemble of New Zealand actors and performers filled out the ship's complement, creating for the impression of a genuinely populated vessel rather than a production conveyance. Other crew members include John Wright, Will Wallace, Frank Edward, Crawford Thompson, Richard Cavenagh, Stephen Hall, Joy Floa, and many others. These performers participated in some of the film's most physically demanding sequences, including the log bridge scene and various battles with the Skull Island prehistoric fauna. Peter Jackson's cameo. In the tradition of Alfred Hitchcock and many other directors who have inserted themselves into their own films. Peter Jackson appeared in a brief cameo in King Kong, specifically as one of the World War I biplane gunners who attacked Kong atop at the Empire State Building. It is a small, humorous, and affectionate touch entirely in keeping with the spirit of filmmakers making his most personal project. Jackson's son Billy also appeared in the film, extending the family involvement in what was genuinely a passion project. Frank Darabont's cameo. Acclaimed filmmaker Frank Darabont, director of The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile, made a brief cameo appearance in The King Kong, a reflection of the mutual admiration and a friendship that existed within a certain circle of ambitious genre filmmaker during this period. Darabont's presence was a nod to the film's position within a tradition of epic, emotionally committed popular cinema. The native Skull Island performer. The natives of Skull Island were portrayed by a mixed ensemble of Asian, African, Maori, and Polynesian actors and extras who were given dark makeup to achieve a unified pigmentation. The casting decision was controversial in some quarters, with the critics pointing to the problematic racial imagery of depicting indigenous people as savage and threatening in service of colonial adventure narrative. Jackson and his team were aware of these concerns and made various choices in the screenplay to complicate the native characterization, but the film remains open to critique at this point. Vaudeville performers. The film's opening sequence in New York's theatrical world were populated by a range of performers playing various vaudeville actors. These include Hilton Dance, Geoff Dunstan, Daniel Tusla, Paul and Shannon Wilson, Giz Rasmussen, Sonia Voghihue, Peter Corrigan, Cloyne Bogers, Susan Eastwood, and Carl Delia, and Tyrell John and Felicia O'Brien, among others. The vaudeville world of 1993 is depicted with considerable authenticity, drawing in a part on the research Jackson and his co-writers conducted in the memoir, early Hobbit, and other historical sources. Jackson's casting philosophy, authenticity over formula. Examining the complete ensemble of King Kong 2005 reveals a consistent casting philosophy on Peter Jackson's part, where blockbusters of the era often relied on established action stars and bankable names to carry their films. Jackson consistently sought actors of genuine dramatic depth, performers who could bring specific individual humanity to characters who might otherwise function merely as narrative conveniences. The decision to cast Naomi Watts rather than more conventionally glamorous leading lady was rooted in the belief that the emotional core of the story, the relationship between Anne and Kong, required an actress capable of genuine vulnerability rather than spectacular beauty. Similarly, casting Adrien Brody or Jack Driscoll rather than a traditional action hero gave the film a romantic lead who felt like a real person with real limitations and real emotional needs rather than the archetype. The choice of Jack Black for Denham was perhaps the most counterintuitive given Black's reputation as a comedian, but it reflects Jackson's understanding that the character's power lies in his seductive energy, his ability to make people believe in his vision even when the evidences before them suggest they should flee. A more obviously sinister actor who would have undermined the film's exploration of how charismatic obsession can corrupt otherwise decent people. Jackson's trust in the cast was evident throughout the production. He gave his actors considerable freedom to develop their characters within the framework of script, and the result is an ensemble that feels genuinely lived in rather than mechanically assembled. The relationship between characters, Hayes and Jimmy's surrogate father-son bond, Driscoll and Ann's awkward romance, Denham and Preston's employer-conscience dynamic feel authentic and specific rather than generically functional. Jackson also drew extensively on his network of trusted New Zealand performers for smaller roles and supporting parts. Actors like Jed Brophy, Mark Hadlow, and Tyrell Mora had long histories of collaboration with Jackson, and their presence contributed to the creative atmosphere of the mutual trust and professional ease that benefited the production as a whole. Many of these performers would reunite with Jackson for the Hobbit trilogy later in decade. The cast and film's legacy, awards, reception, and lasting impact. King Kong 2005 was released on December 14, 2005, with its world premiere in the New York City on December 5. The film was significant critical and commercial success, earning approximately $550 million worldwide against a production budget of $207 million and generating an additional 100 millions in DVD sales. At Academy Awards, it won 3 Oscars: Best Sound Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Visual Effects, the last of which was, in significant part, a recognition of the extraordinary motion capture work achieved by Serkis and the Weta Digital team. The critical consensus around the ensemble was broadly positive. Watts was almost universally praised for giving the film its emotional heart, and Serkis received widespread recognition for its groundbreaking work as Kong. Black's performance was more divisive. Some found his energy perfectly calibrated to the character, while others felt his comic persona occasionally undermined the film's more serious ambitions. But even his critics generally acknowledged the commitment and intelligence he brought to the role. Brody Jack Driscoll received perhaps the most muted critical response of the principal cast. Some reviewers felt that the character was underdeveloped relative to the script's more generous treatment of Anna and Denham, and Brody, despite of his obvious talents, was given insufficient material to work with. This criticism has some validity. Driscoll functioned largely as a reactive character, one whose role is defined primarily by his relationship with Anne and his opposition to Denham's success. Excuses rather than by any particularly distinctive inner life. The supporting cast received considerable praise from those reviewers who took part the time to acknowledge them. Even Parke Hines, Jamie Bells, Jimmy, and Thomson Kretschmann and Englehorn were consistently cited as highlight of the ensemble. Performers who brought genuine depth and specificity to the role that the film could not afford to develop at the great length given its already substantial running time of 3 hours and 7 minutes. In the years since the release, King Kong 2005 has grown in critical esteem. It is increasingly recognized as a major achievement, not just technically impressive blockbuster, but a film of genuine emotion, ambition, and authentic feeling. Central to the resonance in an appreciation of the casting, the decision to build the film around performers of the real dynamic depth rather than conventional action movie stars gave its humanity that it has aged for better than its special effects driven contemporaries. Andy Serkis' work on the King Kong was a significant landmark in the ongoing debate about motion capture and performance. His advocacy for the recognition of the most capture acting as a form of genuine artistic expression, a cause he has pursued vigorously in the years since he was strengthened by the widely acknowledged emotional power of his Kong, while the broader industry has been slowly to fully integrate motion capture performance into its award recognition framework. The quality of Serkis's work has continued to drive the conversation forward. Naomi Watts' performance established her as a leading actress capable of carrying an epic blockbuster while delivering an intimate, emotionally present performance. Her work in King Kong demonstrated a range and a physical commitment that few of her contemporaries could have matched, and it remains one of the defining performances of her career. Adrien Brody, while somewhat overshadowed by the film's visual spectacle and by the scale of Watts and Black's performances, demonstrated the value of bringing genuine dramatic craft to the challenge of anchoring a blockbuster hero. The human heart of a giant story. King Kong 2005 is at its core a story about the collision between wonder and exploitation, between the natural world and the human appetite for spectacle, between the love and the destructive force of ambition. It tells this story through the visual effects of breathtaking ambition and the scale. But those effects would mean nothing, would register as a mere technical display rather than genuine art without the performance that anchored them in human reality. Peter Jackson's casting of King Kong 2005 was one of the most significant artistic decisions he made in the production. By choosing Naomi Watts as Ann Darrow, he secured a performer capable of giving the film its emotional center, a woman whose relationship with Kong would move audiences to genuine feeling rather than more spectacle. By the casting Andy Serkis as Kong, he pushed the boundaries of what motion capture could achieve and created one of the cinema's most memorable non human characters. By surrounding these central performances with a rich ensemble of skilled actors, he populated the world of his film with enough human specificity to make its extraordinary events feel genuinely consequential. The casting of Jack Black as Carl Denham brought a specific kind of dangerous charisma to the film's central antagonist, a figure who must be compelling even as he condemned. Adrien Brody's Jack Driscoll provided the romantic hero with intellectual depth and a recognizable human awkwardness. Thomas Kretschmann's Englehorn anchored the practical world of the venture with quiet authority. Jamie Bell and Ivan Parke created in Jimmy and Hayes a father-son relationship of genuine emotional weight. Kylie Chandler used Bruce Baxter to comment gently on the gap between cinematic heroism and in real-world counterpart. Colin gave Preston a moral clarity that serves as the production's conscience. Taken together, these performers, supported by an extensive ensemble of New Zealand and international actors in small roles, created a version of the King Kong story that honored its classic source while achieving genuine emotional and artistic ambitions of its own. King Kong 2005 stands as a monument to what is possible when a filmmaker of rare vision ensemble performers of comparable skill and commitment in service of a story that is at its deepest level about the tragedy of beauty destroyed by the appetite for the spectacle. The film's final image, Kong falling from the Empire State Building as Anne watches below, heartbroken. The cameras of the gathered press capturing every detail, is one of the great cinematic images of the early 21st century. It is powerful because of its visual scale and technical accomplishment, but it is devastating because of the performances that preceded it. Because Naomi Watts made Anne's grief real, because Andy Serkis made Kong's life and death genuinely matter, and because the entire ensemble conspired to make the audiences care. That is the enduring achievement of King Kong's casting, not merely assembling the right people for the right roles, but creating the conditions in which the genuine feeling became possible in the middle of the most spectacular blockbuster cinema of the age. Peter Jackson's King Kong, released in December 2005, stands as one of the most ambitious, expensive, and emotionally resonant blockbuster films of the 2000s, a loving remake of the classic 1933. This sprawling 3-hour epic brought together the state of the art visual effects, towering practical sets, and a cast of acclaimed performers to breathe new life into one of the cinema's most enduring mythological figures. The film is a testament to what happens when a director with a genuine personal connections to source material is given the resources and creative freedom to pursue an artistic vision without compromises. From its turbulent development history, spanning nearly a decade, to its triumphant theatrical debut and record breaking home media performance, King Kong 2005 remains a landmark achievement in modern filmmaking. This article examines in the depth of the full story of the film's creation, releases, and cultural impact, covering every major phase of its journey from concept and cultural legacy. Production, development, and pre production. Origins: A boy and a monster. The story of Peter Jackson's King Kong begins not in boardroom or a studio pitch meeting, but in the living room of the modest New Zealand's home, sometimes around 1969. A young boy, roughly 8 or 9 years old, sat in front of a television set and watched grainy black and white film from 1933. What he saw changed his life irrevocably. The image of a giant ape falling from the top of the Empire State Building moved him so profoundly that, by his own account, he wept in front of television. The boy was Peter Jackson, and the film was, of course, the original King Kong. In that moment, Jackson later recalled, he decided that he wanted to be a filmmaker. He wanted to make movies just like King Kong. That childhood encounter would take over 3 decades to fully realize, but the seed planted in the New Zealand sitting room would eventually blossom into one of the cinema's most spectacular productions. Jackson did not merely admire the original film from distance. As a 12-year-old, he attempted to recreate it using his parents' Super 8mm film camera. He fashioned a model of Kong from wire and rubber and used his mother's fur coat to stimulate the creature's thick hair. His ambition far exceeded his resources. However, the young filmmaker managed only a few seconds of footage depicting Empire State Building finale before the project collapsed. Under the weight of its own impracticality, the tools and the knowledge required to translate what is existed in were simply beyond the research of a child in 1970 New Zealand, but the dream never left him. The first attempt, Universal Comes Calling, 1995 to 1997. By the mid of 1990s, Jackson had established himself a filmmaker of considerable originality through genre films like Bad Taste 1987, Braindead 1992, and internationally acclaimed Heavenly Creatures 1994. It was he was while he was in the midst of making his first Hollywood production, The Frighteners 1996 for Universal Pictures, that the studio that owned the right to King Kong first approached him about a directing remake. The offer was everything Jackson had dreamed of since childhood. Universal Pictures was prepared to back a major remake in the 1933 classic, and they wanted Jackson at the helm. Development moved quickly at first. Jackson and his partner Fran Welch, who would barely become his most important creative collaborator throughout his career, sat down to write a script. Weta Digital and Weta Workshop, the visual effect companies and the Jackson had co-founded, and the world later became renowned through the Lord of Rings, began early work on the visual effect test. The complex task of building a CGI version of the New York City as it looked in 1933 was among the first challenges undertaken. Sets were designed, locations, scouting commands, and Sumatra and New Zealand, and production infrastructure began to take shape. The plan was to begin filming sometime in 1997 for a summer 1998 release date. Universal approved of the initial script, with the filmmaker Robert Zemeckis brought an executive producer. Jackson's casting vision for the first iteration, the characteristically ambitious. He flew to the set of James Cameron Titanic in Mexico in the late 1996 to meet with Kate Winslet following her collaboration on Heavenly Creature about the possibility of her playing Ann Darrow. Minnie Driver was also reportedly considered for the role. For the male leads, Jackson had his eyes on George Clooney and Robert De Niro for the roles of Jack Driscoll and Carl Denham, respectively. These were not idle dreams. The project had momentum, institutional support, and the full energy of director who had been waiting his whole life for this opportunity. At the same time, Jackson found himself navigating competing offers to obligations. Have Harvey Weinstein and Miramax Film were working to acquire the film right to The Hobbit and The Lord of Rings, with Jackson attached to adopt those books. 20th Century Fox was also attempting to recruit him to direct their planned 2001 remake of The Plant or the Apes. Jackson turned down Planet of the Apes, but as the Winston took longer than expected to secure the Lord of Ring rights from the producer Saul Zaentz, Jackson decided to move forward with King Kong. Weinstein was reportedly furious Jackson that then he proposed a deal in which Universal and Miramax would co-finance and the film equally, with the Universal receiving American distribution right and Miramax covering foreign territories. Jackson was also guaranteed final cut privilege, a percentage of a gross profit, and full artistic control, with all the filming in the visual effect to be handled in New Zealand. But just as the project seemed on the verge of entering full production, the wreck was totally pushed out from under it. In January 1997, rough 6 or 7 months after Beta Workshop had begun serious preparatory work, Universal pulled the plug on the production. The studio decision was shaped by commercial concern rather than any dissatisfaction with Jackson's vision. Several ape and giant monster related films were entering production or nearly releasing around the time, and the studio feared that the market would be saturated. The financial performance of some of these rival productions would indeed prove underwhelming. Jackson and his team were left with an ambitious script of a collection of early design work and dream deferred. Rather than dwell on the setback, Jackson pivoted to the other major project waiting in the wing. In The Lord of Rings, right had been fully secured, and New Line Cinema was preparing to go back not one but three films simultaneously. Jackson agreed to take on what would become one of the most audacious filmmaking projects in cinema history, shooting all the three Lord of Rings films back to back over 16 months with 274 days of principal photography. For the next several years, King Kong would have to wait. The Return, Universal Revive of the Project 2003. The wait proved to have been entirely worthwhile. The Fellowship of Ring 2001 and Two Towers 2002 were born massive critical and commercial success, transforming Jackson's from a cult filmmaker to genre picture into one of the most celebrated and commercially powerful directors in the Hollywood. With the return of the King still in post-production, Universal approached Jackson again in again 2003 to discuss reviving the King Kong project. The studio's tone was entirely different this time. Jackson now had the clout, the proven track record, and the technical infrastructure to make King Kong entirely on his own team. In March 2003, Universal set off a target December 2005 release date, and the project was officially back in motion. Jackson made a deal with Universal whereby would receive a salary of $20 million against 20% of the box office gross for directing, producing, and co-writing these films. He shared this fee with the co-writers Wallish, whose credit also covered her producing role, and Philippia Boyens, who had joined the Lord of the Rings writing team and was now brought in the collaborate of the King Kong script as well. Jackson offered the New Line Cinema, which had produced The Lord of Rings, the opportunity of co-finance King Kong with the Universal, but they declined. Universal and Jackson initially projected a budget of $150 million. The new writing process began in earnest in the late October 2003. Jackson, Welsh, and Boynes were immediately dissatisfied in the script that Welsh and Jackson had written back in 1996, viewing it as a rushed and overly provincial first pass at the material. Rather than attempting to revise the earlier draft, the three writers essentially started fresh. They chose to base the new screenplay film on the 1933 original film, rather than a 1996 draft, returning to the story's Depression era setting and its roster of iconic characters. They also drew on James Ashmore Creelman's screenplay for the original film, incorporating scenes that had been abandoned or omitted during the production of the 1933 version. The character transformation in the new script were significant. Jack Driscoll, who had been reimagined as a World War I veteran in the 1966 draft, became a playwright, which gives the story a more literary and theatrical dimension and allowed for a richer contrast between the artistic world of the New York and the primal world of Skull Island. Ann Darrow was transformed from an archaeologist into an aspiring vaudeville actress struggling to survive in Depression era New York, a characterization that would give Naomi Watts a considerably more dramatic material to work with and that grounded the character's vulnerability in recognizable human circumstances. Carl Denham, the film director who instigates the fateful voyage to Skull Island, was more firmly molded, and Orson Welles, the mercurial, visionary, self-destruction filmmaker whose charisma and recklessness made him both compelling and dangerous. To make the central relationship between Ann Darrow and Kong is emotionally plausible and affecting as possible, the writing team spent considerable time studying gorilla behavior and psychology. They reviewed hours of footage on the gorillas in both captivity and while paying close attention to the animal emotional expressiveness to their social dynamic and their capacity for something that resembled recognition and connection across the species line. Jackson also optioned early Howick, a memoir written by vaudeville performers June Howick, to help to Welsh and Bonnier more fully flesh out and Darrow's backstory and give the character a specific historical grounded professional identity. The new draft was complete in February 2004. The casting of King Kong moved quickly once the new script was in place. For the role of Ann Darrow, Jackson selected Australian actress Naomi Watts, who had recently received wide acclaim and an Academy Award nomination for her performance Gram 21 2003. Watt brought a combination of vulnerability, resilience, and emotional authenticity to the role of the Jackson felt was essential to make the audience's investment in the Kong's family for on genuinely moving rather than merely spectacular. For Carl Denham, Jackson chose Jack Black as an actor known primarily for comedic roles. The selection surprised the observer, but Jackson's reasoning was grounded to be in a specific performance he had seen. Black's worth in High Fidelity 2000 and High impressed Jackson with its ability to combine enormous energy and surface charisma with underlying emotional complexity. For research, Black studied both P. T. Barnum and Orson Welles, the latter whom he had been explicitly identified as a model of Denham in the written process. Black described the spirit of the characters he was channeling as a reckless, a man operating entirely on instinct and bravado without adequate consideration of the consequences. for those around him. Adrien Brody, who had won Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance in Roman Polanski The Pianist 2002, was cast as Jack Driscoll. Thomas Kretschmann, who had also appeared in The Pianist, was brought into the play Captain Englehorn, the morally ambiguous sailor who pilots the expedition ship. Colin Hank, Jamie Bell, and veteran British actor Ivan Parke rounded out the core supporting cast. Andy Serkis, who had broken entirely new ground with his motion capture performance as a golem in The Lord of the Rings, was cast in the dual role of Lumpy and a ship's cook, and more crucially, as the motion capture performers whose physicality, the emotional expressiveness, would form the foundation of the Kong's digital characterization. One of casting story that took on considerable poignancy involved for Vere, the actresses who had played Ann Darrow in the original 1933 film. Jackson wanted Vere to appear in a brief cameo in the new film and to speak the film's final line. It was a beauty killed the beast. It would have been deeply meaningful moment of the semantic continuity, linking the two productions across 7 decades and honoring the actresses who had given the original its more indelible performances. Ray agreed to the cameo, but she passed away during the pre-production on the August 8, 2004, at the age of 96. Before the scene could be filmed, Jackson acknowledged the loss as a genuinely sorrowful one. The native extras who would wear in a Skull Island sequence were drawn from a diverse group of Asian, African, Maori, and Polynesian actors of the performers, who were going given a consistent appearance through the application of makeup. The casting the decision would later attract criticism from some reviewers who felt that the representation of Ireland's native population reproduced racial stereotypes from the original 1933 film, though it was generally acknowledged that Jackson had not acted with deliberate discriminatory intent. Filming photography begins. Principal photography on King Kong commenced on September 2004-6 at Camperdown Studio in Miramar District, Wellington, New Zealand. Jackson had assembled around him essentially the same creative team that had helped in the realize the vast ambition of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Cinematographer Andrew Lesnie, who had won the Academy Award for the Best Cinematography for the Fellowship of the Ring, returned to handle the camera. Production designer Grant Major, art directors Simon Bright and Dan Hanna, conceptual designer Alan Lee, and editor Jamie Slackrick all reprised their collaborative roles from the Rings trilogy. The production operated out of the Stone Street studio, the complex Miramar that had been expanded significantly during the making of Lord of Rings. The sheer scale of physical production was extraordinary. The New Zealand served as the setting for virtually every location in the film section of Times Square, Broadway, and Fifth Avenue from 1930s New York City were constructed on a vacant plot of land in the Seaview and industrial suburb Lower Hutt City on Wellington Harbour, roughly 20 minutes northeast of central Wellington. These Depression-era street sets were built with the remarkable attention to period details, creating the architecture, signing and atmosphere of the city in the grip of economic crisis. The street was but later reduced to the sphere as Harlot Square, allowing the production to extract maximum value from the physical infrastructure it had built. Camperdown Studio housed the most spectacular of the practical sets, including a full-scale recreation of the native village on the Skull Island and the Great Wall, the massive barrier behind which Kong held dominion over the island. The native village and a wall were constructed above the chalet near the Massey Memorial at the Point Halswell, while the arrival of the Skull Island and the breathtaking dinosaur stampede sequence were filmed at Lyall Bay, one of the Wellington's most popular surfing beaches located south of Miramar. The production team chose Lyall Bay for its particular combination of open sandy terrain and dramatic coastal backdrop, which could be augmented through digital effects to create the prehistoric landscape of Skull Island. Ocean scenes aboard the expedition vessel SS Venture were filmed aboard a full-scale deck constructed in the parking lot of Camperdown Studio, backed by an extensive green screen system with the surrounding ocean digitally added in post-production. Further, ocean-going scenes were filmed on a location around Capiti Island, a protected bird sanctuary located off Wellington's Capri coast approximately 45 minutes from the central Wellington and on the Cook Strait, the stretch of water that connects Wellington to Picton at the northern tip of the South Island. An unplanned episode during these oceans shoot occurred in the March 2005 when Jackson and his crew were filming on the Venture and the boat began taking on water, flooding the entire room and forcing an unscheduled evacuation to Capiti Island. The Broadway theater sequence, in which Carl Denham faithfully decided to exhibit Kong to paying New York audience with catastrophic result, were filmed at two of the New Zealand's most architecturally distinctive venues. The interior of the Alhambra, Alhambra and theatre was represented by Wellington's historic opera house and 111113 Manor Street. The exterior sequence depicting the grandeur of major Broadway venues they film are at the Aculand Civic Theatre or Queen Street, a spectacular 1920 movie place built in fantasy Moorish and Indian architectural motifs, capable of accommodating an audience of 2,378 in its ornate main auditorium. Budget pressure and production challenges. Filming lasted from September 2004 through March 2005, a period of roughly 6 months, but the production was not full without the significant pressure and complications. The budget, initially set at $150 million, escalated steadily as the scale of the production demanded resources beyond what had originally been finished. The budget climbed up first to the $175 million and eventually reached the then record breaking figure of $207 million. The New Zealand government provided a subsidy of $34 million, which made the film for a period of the most expensive ever made. Marketing and promotion consist or cost with the estimated an additional $60 million on the top of the production budget. The budget overrun was a source of tension between Jackson and Universal Production Pictures. When the production went approximately $32 million over this approved budget, Jackson reportedly covered the surplus himself rather than the hard production or compromise his vision. Universal was the understandably nervous about the escalating cost. The length of the film reflected Jackson's commitment to telling the story with full emotional depth and narrative detail. He refused to reduce Kong's introduction or truncate the Skull Island sequences in the way that would have compromised the film's ability to generate genuine emotional investment in the relationship between Anne and Kong. The decision to maintain the extended running time was vindicated by the critical and commercial response to the finished film. Through the runtime did become one of the most frequently cited criticisms from reviewers who warned the pacing uneven in New York City find act. Andy Serkis and the creation of Kong, one of the most technically groundbreaking aspects of the production was the approach taken by realizing Kong himself. Jackson saw King Kong as an opportunity to push the technology and artistry of motion capture's performance to new heights, building on the foundation that Andy Serkis had established with the portrayal of Colin in The Lord of the Rings. Jackson commissioned Kristen River of the Vita Digital to supervise all aspects of the King's performances, coordinating the complex interplay between Serkis' physical and emotional input and the digital artists who would translate that input into their first finished creature. Serkis approached Kong with the same care, same rigor, and commitment that he brought to any conventional acting role. He spent months studying gorilla behavior and movement, reviewing extensive footage of gorillas in the wild and in captivity. He worked with primatologists and gorilla specialists to understand not just how gorillas move, but how they express emotion, establish dominance, and show affection, and communicate across the species boundaries. The hours of gorilla footage that Serkis and the writing team reviewed information. Both the physical vocabulary of the Kong's performance and the emotional logic of his relationship with Ann Darrow. Serkis performed his motion capture work wearing a specialized suit embedded with the sensor that tracked his body movement in real while transmitting the data that would be used by Weta Digital Animator to drive Kong's digital skeleton. Facial capture technology recorded the subtitle Serkis expressions, which were then translated and scaled up to the proportion or a 25-foot gorilla while retaining the essential emotional truth of performance. The result was a digitally characterized of the unpredicted emotional expressiveness, one of the critics and the audience would widely describe as the most convincing computer-generated character in film up to that point. Weta Workshop also constructed detailed miniature models for the use in approximately light 108 miniature shots throughout the film, continuing the tradition of practical miniature works that had contributed so significantly to visual authenticity of The Lord of the Rings. The combination of the all large particle set miniaturing work, motion capture performance, and digital effects creating the production approaches every department of the film of its capabilities. Post production visual effects at Veta Digital. Post production on the King Kong was an enormous undertaking reflecting the extraordinary ambition of what had been captured during the principal photography and what needed to be added digitally to realize Jackson's vision. Veta Digital, which had built its reputation and technical capabilities through the Lord of the Rings trilogy, now faced the challenge of creating a fully believed, living, breathing, emotionally expressive giant gorilla who could carry a major motion picture as a central character. The technical demands were like anything the studio had previously attempted. The digital environment of Skull Island required the creation of an entirely imaginary prehistoric world populated with creatures drawn from various periods of paleontological history. The famous sequence in which Kong battled not only but three Tyrannosaurus or Rex simultaneously while holding Ann Darrow in one hand was among the most technically demanding sequences in the film. The choreography of the fight, which takes place in the ravine and involves the creature falling and switching through the landscape in a continuous escalating series of impossible physical confrontation, required months of work by a Weta digital animator to achieve the scenes of weight, momentum, and physical consequences that would make it feel visceral, real rather than cartoon like. The Brontosaurus stampede sequence presented its own unique challenges. The production needed to stimulate an entire herd of massive prehistoric creatures moving at high speed through a narrow canyon while a member of the human cast attempted to evade them, with the some of the human character being crushed or trapped in the process. The scale of the stimulation, combining individual creature animation with crowd simple creation technology and interaction with both practical environment and digitally enhanced landscape, required significant advances in the software tool available to Vita Digital technical team. The New York City sequence in the film's climatic final act, in which Kong runs amok through the city, ultimately scales the Empire State Building while persuading military biplanes, required the digital extension and augmentation of a practical street set built in New Zealand to create convincingly realized version of the 1933 Manhattan. Period accurate vehicles, architecture, crowds, and the atmospheric details were added digitally to the practical footage of the create seamless Depression era cityscape. The battle above it were primarily achieved through the digital means, with Beta Digital creating a detailed model of the both building and helped the period aircraft involved. The sheer volume and complexity of digital work required for the King Kong made the post-production period one of the most intensive in the history of visual effects cinema, to the point hundreds of Vita digital artists worked around the clock during the final months before the December 2005 release date, racing to complete the enormous quantity of the shots that needed to be finished to deliver the film on time. The pressure was immense and the margin for further error was minimal, but the quality of the finished visual effect work ultimately earned the film the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects among the other honors. The composer controversy. One of the most dramatic and widely reported episode of the power production period involved in the film music. Howard Shore, who had composed the Academy Award winning score for all the three of the Lord of the Rings films, whose musical collaboration with Jackson represented one of the most celebrated director composer partnerships in the modern cinema, was originally engaged to score King Kong as well. Shore worked with Jackson throughout much of the production period and completed and recorded a substantial number of musical cues for the film. However, approximately 7 weeks before the film's scheduled theatrical release, Jackson and Shore parted their ways. The precise nature of the creative disagreement between the two was not publicly detailed in full, but Jackson and Universal faced extraordinary challenge of finding the engaging a replacement composer willing and able to write an entire orchestral score for the 3-hour blockbuster in a matter of weeks. Jackson turned into James Newton Howard, an accomplished composer whose credits include The Sixth Sense, Dinosaur and Atlantis, The Lost Empire, however, Howard accepting the daunting assignment. The replacement of the short with Howard so late in the post-production process was a significant logistical and creative challenge. Howard had to watch the finished film, conceptualize an entire musical approach, compose and arrange a full orchestral score, and oversee its recording with the professional musician, all within a time frame that would typically be considered inadequate for the scoring a film of far more modest generation. That he succeeded in delivering a score of genuine quality under these extraordinary circumstances was widely acknowledged as a remarkable professional achievement. James Newton Howard's score for King Kong demonstrated a sensitivity to the film's emotional dynamics that bailed the frantic condition of its creation. The musical appropriately distinguished between the urban world of Depression era New York, rendered it with period appropriate musical color and the primal, threatening yet also wondrous, full of Skull Island. The theme associated with the Kong himself balanced the creature's physical power and danger with an underlying pathos that reinforced the audience's complex emotional relationship with the character. The score of subsequent nominated for the Golden Globe Award for the Best Original Sound Score, a significant recognition of Howard's achievement given the circumstances of the competition. Interestingly, Howard's surname was not entirely erased from the finished film. Shore had been cast in a small acting role as the conductor of the theater orchestra in Broadway sequence from which Kong makes his escape, and his appearance in the role remained in the final cut of the film. Somewhat ironic detail given the circumstances of his departure from the production, but one that demonstrated a certain generosity of spirit on Jackson's part. The film's soundtrack. Beyond the score composed by James Newton Howard, the film's soundtrack incorporated several period appropriate musical pieces that helped authenticate the 1930s setting. A.L. Jolson recordings of I Am Sitting on the Top of the World was used in the film was Peggy Lee's rendition of Bye Bye Blackbird. The use of period recordings gave the New York sequences a sense of genuine historical texture that reinforced the film's meticulous visual creation of the era. Jackson's and his musical team also incorporated certain thematic elements drawn from Max Steiner's celebrated original score for the 1930 film, offering audiences familiar with the classic an additional layer of connection to the source material. The official soundtrack album featuring James Newton Howard's score was released on December 7, 2005, one week before the film's theatrical opening by Decca Records. The release was accompanied by positive responses from critics who wrote about film music, and the nomination for the Golden Globe represented the wider industry's recognition of the score quality. Release. Theatrical release. Marketing campaign. The marketing campaign for King Kong was one of the most elaborate and strategically coordinated promotional efforts of 2005. It began in earnest on June 27, 2005, when the film's teaser trailer made its debut in a manner that reflected the increasingly interest driven nature of contemporary film marketing. The trailer first appeared online at the official Volkswagen website at 8:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, an unusual choice of platform that reflected a cross-promotional partnership between Universal and German automobile manufacturer. 10 minutes later, at 8:55 p.m. EST, Ernest Standard Eastern Standard Time, the trailer was simultaneously broadcast across multiple media outlets owned by NBCU Universal, the corporate parent of Universal Studios, including NBC, Bravo, CNBC, and MSNBC. The trailer then appeared in the movie theaters attached to the print of Steven Spielberg's War of the World, which opened in cinemas on June 29. The coordinated multi-platform launch of the teaser was considered as a sophisticated and effective piece of movie marketing for its time. The Peter Jackson contributed significantly to the marketing effort through the ongoing publication of his production diaries, a series of behind the scene video updates that had been chronicling the making of the film since shortly after the DVD release of The Return of the King. The diaries of had begun as way to give Jackson's substantial Lord of the Rings fanbase a window into his next projects, and then they proved remarkably effective at sustaining audiences' interest and enthusiasm over the long months between the official announcement of the film and its release. The individual diary entries were edited into short installments of 3 or 4 minutes each and distributed in a format accessible over broadband internet connection, which was itself still a relatively novel means of content distribution in 2004 and early 2005. The production diaries covered every aspect of filmmaking process with a degree of candor and depth that was unusual for a major studio production. They featured tours of the sets, interviews with the key creative personnel on both the acting and technical sides of the production, glimpses inside the sound mixing studios and motion capture facilities, and an honest portrayal of the creative challenges and the physical demand of making a film of this scale. The diaries were particularly effective in building audiences' curiosity and affection for the project because they communicated Jackson's own genuine passion of the material, which was evident in every frame. The production diaries were released as a stand-alone DVD release on December 13, 2005, one day before the film's American theatrical opening. The release was housed in an elaborated package designed to resemble a 1930s era clipboard, complete with a set of production art prints and 52-page production memoir. This was genuinely unusual approach to supplementary film material, which was typically reserved for post-release DVD special edition. The decision to release making of material before the film itself is a premium format was at the time considered innovative and was noted as a significant cultural movement in the evolution of film and culinary market. World premiere: King Kong held its world premiere in New York City on December 5, 2005 at the Lois Lincoln Square Movie Theatre. The event was a major Hollywood occasion, drawing enormous crowd and extensive media coverage. The premiere took place in the same city where the film's climatic sequences are set and where the original 1933 King Kong had itself gave premiered 72 years earlier, which gave the evening a particular resonance for those familiar with the film's history. Jackson attended with his cast and creative team, and the reception from those who saw the film that evening was warmly enthusiastic. The New Zealand's theatrical release followed on December 13, 2005, one day before the American opening. The film's release in New Zealand had a particular significance given that essentially the entire production had been undertaken in the country, employing thousands of New Zealand craftspeople, technicians, actors, and industry professionals. The relationship between Jackson and his home country's film industry was one of the defining stories of early 21st century cinema, and the King Kong represented the continuation and deepening of that relationship. The United States theatrical release on December 14, 2005 was accompanied by the opening weekend that, while commercially very strong in absolute terms, fell somewhat short of the extraordinary numbers that Universal and industry analysts had hoped for given the film's record-breaking budget. The film opened to approximately $50 million in the opening weekend in North America, a figure that placed it among the strongest openings of the year, but that was viewed in some quarters as underwhelming for the production of such enormous cost and such extensive promotional investment. Box office performance. While the opening weekend performance may have generated some initial anxiety, King Kong proved to be a film with genuine staying power at the box office. Over the course of its theatrical run, the film accumulated a domestic gross of approximately $218 million in the United States and Canada. Its international performance was similarly strong, with the film performing well in major markets across Europe, Asia, and Australia. The combined worldwide gross reached approximately $557 to $562 million, depending on the final accounting period used. The Human Heart of a Giant Story. King Kong 2005 is at its core a story about the collision between wonder and exploitation, between the natural world and the human appetite for spectacle, between the love and the destructive force of ambition. It tells the story through visual effects of breathtaking ambition and scale, but those effects would mean nothing, would register as a mere technical display rather than genuine art, without the performances that anchor theme in human reality. Peter Jackson's casting of King Kong 2005 was one of the most significant artistic decisions he made in the production. By choosing Naomi Watts as Ann Darrow, he secured a performer capable of giving the film its emotional center, a woman whose relationship with Kong would move audiences to genuine feeling rather than the most mere spectacle. By casting Andy Serkis as Kong, he pushed the boundaries of what motion capture could achieve and created one of the cinema's most memorable non-human characters. By surrounding these central performances with a rich ensemble of skilled character anchor, he populated the world of his film with enough human specificity to make its extraordinary event feel genuinely consequential. The casting of Jack Black as Carl Denham brought a specific kind of dangerous charisma to the film's central antagonist, a figure who must be compelling even as he is condemned. Adrien Brody's Jack Driscoll provided the romantic hero with intellectual depth and as a recognizable human awkwardness. Thomas Kretschmann's Englehorn anchored the practical world of the venture with quiet authority. Jamie Bell and Evan Parke created in Jimmy and Hi's father-son relationship of the genuine emotional weight. Kylie Chandler used Bruce Baxter to comment gently on the gap between cinematic heroism and the real-world counterpart. Colin Hank gave Preston a moral clarity that served as production's conscience. Taken together, these performers, supported by an extensive ensemble of New Zealand and international actors in smaller roles, created a version of the King Kong story that honored its classic source while achieving genuine emotional and artistic ambition of its own, King Kong 2005 stands as a monument to what is possible when a filmmaker of rare vision assembles performers of comparable skill and commitment in the service of story that is at its deepest level about the tragedy of beauty destroyed by the appetite for spectacle. The film's final image, Kong falling from the Empire State Building as Anne watches below, heartbroken. The cameras of the gathered press, capturing every detail, is one of the great cinematic images of the early 21st century. It is powerful because of its visual scale and technical accomplishment, but it is devastating because of the performances that preceded it, because Naomi Watts made Anne's grief real, because Andy Serkis made Kong's life and death genuinely matters, because the entire ensemble conspired to make the audiences care. This is enduring achievement of King Kong's casting, not merely assembling the right people for the right roles, but creating conditions in which genuine feeling becomes possible in the middle of the most spectacular blockbuster cinema of its ages. Peter Jackson's King Kong, released in December 2005, stands as one of the most ambitious, expensive, and emotionally resonant blockbuster films of 2000s, a loving remake of the 1933 classic. This sprawling 3-hour epic brought together state-of-art visual effects, towering practical sets, and a cast of acclaimed performers to breathe new life into one of the cinema's most enduring mythological figures. The film is a testament to what happens when a director with a genuine personal connection to source material is given the resources and creative freedom to pursue an artistic vision without compromise. From its turbulent development, history spanning nearly a decade, to its triumphant theatrical debut and record breaking home media performance, King Kong 2005 remains a landmark achievement in modern filmmaking. This article examines in the depth the full story of the film's creation, release, and cultural impact, covering every major phase of its journey from concept to cultural legacy. Production, development, and pre production. Origins: a boy and a monster. The story of Peter Jackson's King Kong begins not in a boardroom or a studio pitch meeting, but in the living room of a modest New Zealand home, sometimes around 1969. A young boy, roughly 8 or 9 years old, sat in front of a television set and watched a grainy black and white film from 1933. What he saw changed his life irrevocably. The images of a giant ape falling from the top of the Empire State Building moved him so profoundly that his own account he wept in front of the television. That boy was Peter Jackson, and the film, of course, the original King Kong. In the moment Jackson later called, he decided that he wanted to be a filmmaker. He wanted to make a movie just like King Kong. That childhood encounter would take over 3 decades to fully realize, but the seed planted in the New Zealand's sitting room would eventually blossom into one of the cinema's most spectacular productions. Jackson did not merely admire the original film from a distance. As a 12-year-old, he attempted to recreate it using his parents' Super 8mm film camera. He fashioned a model of Kong from wire, rubber, and used his mother's fur coat to stimulate the creature's thick hair. His ambition far exceeded his resources. However, the young filmmaker managed only a few seconds of footage depicting the Empire State Building finale before the project collapsed under the weight of its own impracticality. The tools and the knowledge required to translate what existed in his imagination into something visible on screen were simply beyond the reach of a child in 1970s New Zealand. But the dream never left him. The first attempt, Universal's Comes Calling, 1995-1997. By the mid 1990s, Jackson had established himself as a filmmaker of considerable originality through the genre film like Bad Taste 1987, Brain Dead 1992, and the internationally acclaimed Heavenly Creatures 1994. It was while he was in the midst of making his first Hollywood production, The Frighteners 1996, for the Universal Picture, that the studio that owned the right to King Kong first approached him about direct remake. The offer was everything Jackson had dreamed of since childhood. Universal Pictures was prepared to back a major remake of the 1933 classic, and they wanted Jackson at the helm. Development moved quickly at first. Jackson and his partner Fran Wilson, who would become his most important creative collaborator throughout his career, sat down to write a script. Weta Digital and Weta Workshop, the visual effect companies that Jackson had co founded and that would later become world renowned through the Lord of Rings, began early work on the visual effect tests. The complex task of building a CGI version of the New York City as it looked in 1933 was among the first challenges undertaken. Sets were designed, location scouting commenced in Sumatra and New Zealand, and a production infrastructure began to take shape. The plan was to begin filming sometimes in 1997 for a summer 1998 release date. Universal approved of the initial script, with filmmaker Robert Zemeckis brought an executive producer. Jackson's casting vision for the first iteration was characteristically ambitious. He flew to the set of James Cameron's Titanic in Mexico in late 1996 to meet with Kate Winslet, following their collaboration on Heavenly's Creature, about the possibility of her playing Ann Darrow. Minnie Driver was also reportedly considered for the role for the male leads. Jackson had already his eye on George Clooney and Robert De Niro for the roles of Jack Driscoll and Carl Denham, respectively. These were not idle dreams. The project had momentum, institutional support, and the full energy of a director who had been waiting his whole life for this opportunity. At the same time, Jackson found himself navigating competing offers and obligations. Harvey Weinstein, Miramax Film were working to acquire the film rights to The Hobbit and The Lord of Rings, with the Jackson attached to adapt those books. 20th Century Fox was also attempting to recruit him to direct their planned 2001 remake of Planet of the Apes. Jackson turned down Planet of the Apes, but as Weinstein took longer than expected To secure the Lord of Rings right from the producer Saul Zaentz, Jackson decided to move forward with King Kong. Winston was reportedly furious. Jackson then proposed a deal in which Universal and Miramax would co finance the film equally, with Universal receiving American distribution rights and Miramax covering foreign territories. Jackson was also guaranteed final credit privilege, a percentage of gross profit, and full artistic control, with all filming and visual effects to be handled in New Zealand. But just as the project seemed on the verge of entering full production, the rug was pulled out from under it. In January 1997, roughly 6 or 7 months after the Beta workshop had begun serious preparatory work, Universal pulled the plug of the production. The studio's decision was shaped by commercial concerns rather than any dissatisfaction with Jackson's vision. Several ape and giant monster related films were entering production or nearing release around that time, and the studio feared that the market would be saturated. The financial performance of some of these rivals' productions would indeed prove underwhelming. Jackson and his team were left with an ambitious script, a collection of early design work, and a dream deferred. Rather than dwell on the setback, Jackson pivoted to the other major project waiting in the wings. The Lord of Rings rights had been secured. The new line cinema was prepared to back not one but three films simultaneously. Jackson agreed to take on the what would become one of the most audacious filmmaking projects in the cinema history, shooting all three Lord of Rings films back to back over 16 months with 274 days of principal photography. For the next several years, King Kong would have to wait. The Return, Universal Revives of the Project 2003. The wait proved to have been entirely worthwhile. The Fellowship of the Ring 2001 and The Two Towers 2002 were both massive critical and commercial success, transforming Jackson from a cult filmmaker of a genre picture into one of the most celebrated and commercially powerful directors in Hollywood. With the return of the King still in production, the Universal approached Jackson again in early 2003 to discuss reviving the King Kong project. The studio's tone was entirely different this time. Jackson now had the clout, the proven track record, and the technical infrastructure to make King Kong entirely on his own terms. In March 2003, Universal set target December 2005 release date, and the project was officially back in motion. Jackson made a deal with Universal whereby he would receive a salary of $20 million against 20% of the box office gross for directing, producing, and co writing the film. He shared this fee with co writers Welsh, whose credit also covered her producing role, and Philippa Boyens, who had joined the Lord of Rings writing teams and was now brought in to collaborate on the King Kong script as well. Jackson offered New Line Cinema, which had produced The Lord of Rings, the opportunity to co finance King Kong with the Universal, but they declined. Universal and Jackson initially projected a budget of $150 million. The new writing process began in earnest in late October 2003. Jackson, Welch, and Boynier were immediately dissatisfied with the script that Walsh and Jackson had written back in 1996, viewing it as a rushed and overly provisional first pass the material. Rather than attempting to revise the earlier draft, the three writers essentially started fresh. They chose to base the new screenplay firmly on the 1930 original film rather than on the 1966 draft, returning to the story's Depression era setting and its roster of iconic characters. They also drew on James Ashmore Spillman's screenplay for the original film, incorporating scenes that had been abandoned or omitted during the production of the 1933 variant. The characters' transformation into the new script were significant. Jack Driscoll, who had been reimagined as a World War I veteran in the 1996 draft, became a playwright, which gave the story a more liberty and theatrical dimension and allowed for a richer contrast between the artistic world of the New York and the primal world of Skull Island. Ann Darrow was transformed from an archaeologist into an aspiring vaudeville actress struggling to survive in Depression era New York, a characterization that would give Naomi Watts considerably more dramatic material to work with and that grounded the character's vulnerability in the recognizable human circumstances. Carl Denham, the film director who investigates the fateful voyage to Skull Island, was more firmly modeled on Orson Welles, the mercurial, visionary, self destructive filmmaker whose charisma and recklessness made him both compelling and dangerous. To make the central relationship between Anne, Darrow, and Kong as emotionally plausible and affecting as possible, the writing team spent considerable time studying gorilla behavior and psychology. They reviewed hours of footage of gorillas in both captivity and the wild, paying close attention to the animals' emotional expressiveness, their social dynamics, and their capacity of something that resembled recognition and connection across species lines. Jackson also optioned early Havoc, a memoir written by vaudeville performer John Howick, to help Welsh and Boyne more fully flesh out Anne Darrow's backstory and give the character a specific, historically grounded, professional identity. The new draft was completed in February 2004. Assembling the cast. The casting of King Kong moved quickly once the script was in place. For the role of Anne Darrow, Jackson selected Australian actress Naomi Watts, who had recently received wide acclaim and an Academy Award nomination for her performance in 21 Grams 2003. Watts brought a combination of vulnerability, resilience, and emotional authenticity to the role that Jackson felt was essential to making the audience's investment in Kong's feeling fair and genuinely moving rather than merely spectacular. For Carl Denham, Jackson chose Jack Black, an actor known primarily for comedic roles. The selection surprised some observers, but Jackson's reasoning was grounded in a specific performance he had seen. Black's work in High Fidelity 2000 had impressed Jackson with its ability to combine enormous energy and surface charisma with underlying emotional complexity. For research, Black studied both P.T. Barnum and Orson Welles, the latter of whom had been explicitly identified as the model for Denham in writing process. Black described the spirit of the character he was channeling is very reckless, a man operating entirely on instinct and bravado without adequate consideration of the consequences for those around him. Adrien Brody, who had won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance in Roman Polanski's The Pianist 2002, was cast as Jack Driscoll. Thomas Kretschmann, who had also appeared in The Pianist, was brought into the play Captain Englehorn, the morally ambiguous sailor who pilots the expedition ship. Colin Hank, Jamie Bell, and veteran British actor Stephen Parke rounded out the core of supporting cast. Andy Serkis, who had broken entirely new ground with his motion capture performance as Gollum in The Lord of Rings, was the cast in the dual role of Lumpy the ship's cook and most crucially as the motion capture performer whose physicality and emotional expressiveness would form the foundation of Kong's digital characterization. One casting story that took on considerable poignancy involved Faye Ware, the actress who had played Ann Darrow in the original 1933 film. Jackson wanted Ray to appear in a brief cameo in the new film and to speak the film's final line. It was beauty killed the beast. It would have been a deeply meaningful moment of the cinematic continuity linking the two productions across 7 decades and honoring the actress who had given the original its most incredible performance. Very agreed to the cameo, but she passed away during the pre production on August 8, 2004, at the age of 96, before the scene could be filmed. Jackson acknowledged the loss as a genuinely sorrowful one. The native extras who would appear in the Skull Island sequences were drawn from a diverse group of Asian, African, Maori, and Polynesian actors and performers who were given a consistent appearance through the application of makeup. This casting decision would later attract criticism from some reviewers who felt that the representation of the island's native population reproduced racial stereotypes from the original 1933 film, though it was generally acknowledged that Jackson had not acted with deliberate discriminatory intent. Filming. Principal photography began. Principal photography on the King Kong commenced on September 6, 2004 at Camperdown Studios in the Miramar district of Wellington, New Zealand. Jackson had assembled around him essentially the same creative team that had helped him realize the vast ambition of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Cinematographer Andrew Lezine, who had won the Academy Award for Best Cinematography for the Fellowship of the Ring, returned to handle the camera. Production designer Grant Major, art director Simon Bright and Dan Hanna, conceptual designer Alan Lee, and editor Jamie Selicker all reprised their collaborative roles from the Rings trilogy. The production operated out the Stone Street Studios, the complex in Miramar that had been expanded significantly during the making of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The sheer scale of the physical production was extraordinary. New Zealand served as the setting for virtually every location in the film. Sections of Times Square, Broadway, and Fifth Avenue from 1930s New York City were reconstructed on a vacant plot of land in Seaview, an industrial suburb of Lower Hutt City, on Wellington Harbour, roughly 20 minutes northeast of the central Wellington. These Depression era street sets were built with remarkable attention to period detail, recreating the architecture, signage, and atmosphere of the city in the grip of economic crisis. The streets were later redressed to also serve as Harlot Square, allowing the production to extract maximum value from the physical infrastructure it had built. Camperdown Studio housed the most spectacular of the practical set, including a full-scale recreation of the native village on Skull Island and the Great Wall, the massive barrier behind which Kong held dominion over the island. The native village and wall were constructed above the Shelley Bay near the Massey Memorial at the Point Halswell, while the arrival of the Skull Island and the breathtaking dinosaur stampede sequence were filmed at Lyall Bay, one of the Wellington's most popular surfing beaches. Located south Miramar, the production team chose Lyall Bay for its particular combination of open, sandy terrain and dramatic coastal backdrop, which would be augmented through digital effects to create the prehistoric landscape of Skull Island. Ocean scenes aboard the expedition vessel SS Venture filmed abroad. A full-scale deck constructed in the parking lot at a Camperdown studio, backed by an extensive green screen system with the surrounding ocean digitally added in post-production. Further, ocean-going scenes were filmed on location around Kapiti Island, a protected bird sanctuary located off Wellington. Kapiti coast approximately 45 minutes from central Wellington and on the Cook Strait of the stretch of water that connects Wellington to the Picton at the northern tip of the South Island. An unplanned episode during these ocean shoots occurred in March 2005 when the Jackson and his crew were filming on the Venture and big boat began taking on water, flooding the engine room and forcing an unscheduled evacuation to Kapiti Island. The Broadway theatre sequences in which Carl Denham fatefully decides to exhibit Kong to a paying New York audience with a catastrophic result were filmed at two of New Zealand's most architecturally distinctive venues. The interior of the Alhambra Theatre were represented by Wellington's historic Opera House at 111-113 Wellington Manor Street. The exterior sequences depicting the grandeur of major Broadway venues were filmed at the Aculand Civic Theatre on Queen Street, a spectacular 1929 movie palace built in a fantasy of Moorish and Indian architectural motifs, capable of accommodating an audience of 2,378 in its ornate main auditorium. Budget pressures and production challenges. Filming lasted from September 2004 through March 2005, a period of roughly 6 months, but the production was not without its significant pressure and complications. The budget, initially set at $150 million, escalated steadily as the scale of the production demanded resources beyond what had originally been envisioned. The budget climbed first to $175 million and eventually reached then record-breaking figure of $207 million. The New Zealand government provided a subsidy of $34 million, which made the film, for a period, the most expensive ever made. Marketing and promotion costs were estimated at an additional $60 million on the top of production budget. The budget overrun was a source of tension between Jackson and Universal Pictures. When the production went approximately $32 million over its approved budget, Jackson reportedly covered the surplus himself rather than halt the production or compromise his vision. Universal was understandably nervous about the escalating cost and the film's growing runtime. What had been planned as a film of approximately 135 minutes had expanded to a final cut running approximately 205 minutes, or just over 300. Universal executives flew to New Zealand to view a rough cut of the film. Their response, however, was enthusiastic enough to dispel their concern about both the runtime and the budget. Satisfied with what they saw, they agreed to support the extended running time and the additional cost. The length of the film reflected Jackson's commitment to telling the story with full commitment, emotional depth, and narrative detail. He refused to reduce Kong's introduction or truncate the Skull Island sequences in ways that would have compromised the film's ability to generate genuine emotional investment in the relationship between Anne and Kong. The decision to maintain the extended running time was vindicated by the critical and commercial response to the finished film, though the runtime did become one of the most frequently cited criticisms from the reviewers who found the pacing uneven in the New York set first act. Andy Serkis and the creation of Kong, one of the most technically groundbreaking aspect of the production was the approach taken to realize Kong himself. Jackson saw King Kong as an opportunity to push the technology and artistry of motion capture performance to new heights, building on the foundation that Andy Serkis had established with his portrayal of Colin in The Lord of Rings. Jackson commissioned Christine Rivers of Beta Digital to supervise all the aspects of Kong's performance, coordinating the complex interplay between Sarkis's physical and emotional input in the digital artist, who would translate the input into the finished creature. Sarkis approached Kong with the same rigor and commitment that he brought to any conventional acting role. He spent months studying gorilla behavior and movements, reviewing extensive footage of gorilla in the wild and captivity. He worked with primatologists and gorilla specialists to understand not just how gorillas move but how they express emotion, establish dominance, show affection, and communicate across species boundaries. The hours of gorilla footage that Serkis and the writing team reviewed informed both the physical vocabulary of Kong's performance and the emotional logic of his relationship with Anne Darrow. Serkis performed his motion capture work wearing a specialized suit embedded with sensor that tracked his body movement in real time, transmitting data that would be used by Weta digital animator to drive Kong's digital skeleton. facial capture technology recorded the subtitles of Serkis's expression, which were then translated and scaled up to the proportion of 25-foot gorilla while retaining the essential emotional truth of the performance. The result was digital character of unprecedented emotional expressiveness, one that the critics and audience would widely describe as the most convincing computer generated character in film up to that point. Veta Workshop also constructed detailed miniature models for the use in approximately 800 miniature shots throughout the film, continuing the tradition of practical miniature work that had contributed so significantly to the visual authenticity of The Lord of Rings. The combination of large scale practical sets, miniature work, motion capture performance, and digital effects created by production approach of remarkable technical complexity that pushed every department to the limits of its capability. Post production visual effects at Veta Digital. Post production on King Kong was an enormous undertaking, reflecting the extraordinary ambition of what had been captured during principal photography and what needed to be added digitally to realize Jackson's vision. Veta Digital, which had built its reputation and technical capabilities through the Lord of Rings trilogy, now faced the challenges of creating a fully believed, living, breathing, emotionally expressive giant gorilla who could carry a major motion picture as its central character. The technical demands were unlike anything the studio had previously attempted. The digital environment of Skull Island required the creation of an entirely imaginary prehistoric world populated with the creatures drawn from various periods of paleontological history. The famous sequence in which Kong battles not only the three not only one, but three Tyrannosaurus rex simultaneously while holding Ann Darrow in one hand was among the most technically demanding sequences in the film. The choreography of the fight, which takes place in ravine and involves the creature falling and swinging through the landscape in a continuously escalating series of impossible physical confrontations, required months of work by Veta Digital's animator to achieve the sense of weight, momentum, and physical consequences that would make it feel viscerally real rather than cartoon like. The Brontosaurus stampede sequence presented by its own unique challenges. The production needed to stimulate an entire herd of massive prehistoric creatures moving at high speed through a narrow canyon while members of the human cast attempted to evade them, with some of the human characters being crushed or trampled in the process. The scale of the simulation, combining individual creature animation with crowd simulation technology and infrastructure with the both practical environment and digitally enhanced landscape, required significant advances in the soft tools available to Veta Digital's technical team. The New York City sequences in the film's climatic final act, in which Kong runs amok through the city and ultimately scales the Empire State Building while persuaded by military biplanes, required the digital extension and augmentation of the practical street set built in New Zealand to create a convincingly realized version of 1933 Manhattan. Period accurate vehicles, architecture, crowd, and atmospheric details were added digitally to the practical footage to create a seamless Depression era cityscape. The Empire State Building itself and the final aerial battle above it were primarily achieved through digital means, with a Weta Digital creating detailed model of the both the building and the period aircraft involved. The sheer volume and complexity of digital work required for King Kong made the post production period one of the most intensive in the history of visual effects cinema to that point. Hundreds of Vita digital artists worked around the clock during the final months before the December 2005 release date, racing to complete the enormous quantity of shots that needed to be finished to deliver the film on time. The pressure was immense and the margin for the error was minimal, but the quality of the finished visual effects work ultimately earned the film the Academy Award for Best Visual Effect, among other honors. The composer controversy. One of the most dramatic and widely reported episodes of the post production period involved the film's music. Howard Shore, who had composed the Academy Award winning scores for all the three Lord of the Rings films, and whose musical collaboration with Jackson represented one of the most celebrated director composer partnerships in the modern cinema, was originally engaged to score King Kong as well. Shore worked with Jackson throughout much of the production period and completed and recorded a substantial number of musical cues for the film. However, approximately 7 weeks before the film's scheduled theatrical release, Jackson and Shore parted ways. The precise nature of the creative disagreement between the two was not publicly detailed in full, but Jackson and Universal faced the extraordinary challenge of finding and engaging a replacement composer willing and able to write an entire orchestral score for a 3 hour blockbuster in the matter of weeks. Jackson turned to James Newton Howard, an accomplished composer whose credit included The Sixth Sense, Dinosaur, and Atlantis The Lost Empire. Howard accepted the daunting assignment. The replacement of Shore with Howard so late in the post production process was a significant logistical and creative challenge. Howard had to watch the finished film, conceptualize an entire musical approach, compose and arrange a full orchestral score, and oversees its recording with professional musicians, all within a time frame that would typically be considered inadequate for scoring a film of far more modest proportion. Then he succeeded in delivering a score of genuine quality under these extraordinary circumstances was widely acknowledged as a remarkable professional achievement. James Newton Howard's score for King Kong demonstrated a sensitivity to the film's emotional dynamics that belied the frantic condition of its creation. The music appropriately distinguished between the urban world of Depression era New York, rendered with the period appropriate musical color, and the primal threatening yet also wondrous world of Skull Island. The theme associated with the Kong himself balanced the creature's physical power and danger with an underlying pathos that reinforced the audience's complex emotional relationship with the character. The score was subsequently nominated for the Golden Globe Award for the Best Original Score, a significant recognition of Howard's achievement given the circumstances of the composition. Interestingly, Howard Shore's name was not entirely erased from the finished film. Shore had been cast in a small acting role as the conductor of the theater orchestra in a Broadway sequence from which Kong makes his escapes in his appearance in the role remained in the final cut of the film. A somewhat ironic detail given the circumstances of his departure from the production, but one of that demonstrated a certain generosity of spirit on Jackson's part. A film's soundtrack. Beyond the score composed by James Newton Howard, the film's soundtrack incorporated several period appropriate musical pieces that helped the authenticate the 1930s setting. Al Jolson's recording of I Am Sitting on the Top of the World was used in the film, as was Peggy Lee's rendition of Bye Bye Blackbird. The use of period recordings gave the New York sequence a sense of genuine historical texture that reinforced the film's meticulous visual recreation of the era. Jackson and his music taste also incorporated certain thematic elements drawn from Max Steiner and celebrated original score for the 1933 film, offering audiences familiar with the classic and an additional layer of connection to the source material. The official soundtrack album featuring James Newton Howard's score was released on December 7, 2005, one week before the film's theatrical opening by Decca Records. The release was accompanied by positive response from critics who wrote about film music, and the nomination for the Golden Globe represented the wider industry's recognition of the score's quality. Release, theatrical release, marketing campaign. The marketing campaign for King Kong was one of the most elaborate and strategically coordinated promotional efforts of 2005. It began in earnest on June 27, 2005, when the film's teaser trailer made its debut in the manner that reflected the increasingly internet driven nature of contemporary film marketing. The trailer first appeared online at the official Volkswagen website at 8:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, an unusual choice of platform that reflected a cross-promotional partnership between the Universal and the German automobile manufacturer. 10 minutes later, at 8:55 EST, the trailer was simultaneously broadcast across multiple media outlets owned by NBCU Universal, the corporate parent of Universal Studios, including NBC, Bravo, CNBC, and MSNBC. The trailer then appeared in movie theater attached to print on Steven Spielberg's War of World, which opened in cinemas on June 29. The coordinated multi-platform launch of the teaser was considered a sophisticated and effective piece of movie marketing for its time. Peter Jackson contributed significantly to the marketing effort through the ongoing publication of his production diaries, a series of behind the scene video updates that had been chronically the making of the film since shortly after the DVD release of The Return of the King. The diaries had begun as a way to give Jackson's substantial Lord of the Rings fan base window into his next project, and they proved remarkably effective as sustaining audience interest and enthusiasm over the long months between the official announcement of the film and its release. The individual diary entries were edited into short installments of 3 or 4 minutes each and distributed in a format accessible over the billboard internet connections, which was itself still a relatively novel means of content distribution in 2004 and early 2005. The production diaries covered every aspect of the filmmaking process with a degree of candor and the depth that was unusual for major studio production. They featured tours of the set, interview with the key creative personnel on both the acting and technical sides of the production, glimpses inside the sound mixing studio and motion capture facilities, and an honest portrayal of the creative challenges and physical demands of making a film of this scale. The diaries were particularly effective in a building audiences' curiosity and affection for the project because they communicated Jackson's own genuine passion for the material, which was evident in every frame. The production diaries were released as a stand-alone DVD release on December 13, 2005, one day before the film's American theatrical opening. The release was housed in an elaborate package designed to resemble a 1930s era clipboard, completely with a set of production art prints and 52 pages production memoir. This was genuinely unusual approach to supplementary film material, which was typically reserved for the post-release DVD special edition. The decision to release making of material before the film itself is a premium format was at the time considered innovative and was noted as a significant cultural moment in the evolution of film and culinary market. King Kong held its world premiere in New York City on December 5, 2005, at the Lincoln Square Movie Theater. The event was a major Hollywood occasion, drawing enormous crowd and extensive media coverage. The premiere took place in the same city where the film's climatic sequences are set and where the original 1933 King Kong had itself premiered 72 years earlier, which gave the evening a particular resonance for those familiar with the film's history. Jackson attended with all his cast and creative team, and the reception from those who saw the film that evening was warmly enthusiastic. The New Zealand theatrical release followed on December 13, 2005. One day before the American opening, the film releases in New Zealand had a particular significance given that essentially the entire production had been undertaken in the country, employing thousands of New Zealand craft people, technicians, actors, and industry professionals. The relationship between the Jackson and his home country film industry was one of the defining stories of the early 21st century cinema, and the King Kong represented the continuation and the deepening of the relationship. The United States theatrical release on December 14, 2005 was accompanied by an opening weekend that, while commercially very strong in an absolute terms, fell somewhat short of the extraordinary numbers that Universal and industry analysts had hoped for, given the film's record breaking budget. The film opened to approximately $50 million in its opening week in North America, a figure that placed it among the strongest openings of the year, but that was viewed in some quarters as underwhelming for the production of such enormous cost and such extensive promotional investment. Box office performance. While the opening weekend performance may have generated some initial anxiety, King Kong proved to be a film with genuine staying power at the box office over the course of its theatrical run. The film accumulated
a domestic gross of approximately $218 million in the United States and Canada. Its international performance was similarly strong, with the film performing well in major markets across Europe, Asia, and Australia. The combined worldwide gross reached approximately 557 to 562 million dollars, depending on the final accounting period used. Reviews. The King Kong has been global pop culture icon for more than 90 years, and the great ape shows of no sign of slowing down. While most audiences are familiar with just a few Kong entries, you might be surprised to know there are 13 Kong films, including the most recent entry to the Monsterverse, Godzilla vs. Kong: New Empire, which despite the second billing is very much a Kong-centric film across television, film, comic, and novels. Kong has yet to be aped, though other primates have certainly tried. Below, I make the climb down from where the original Kong met his tragic fate and rank his films from near death experiences to satisfying safety. Here are the worst to be best. The third animated Kong film and the second to follow Kong. The animated series is just about as bottom of the barrel as you can get in the Kong saga, made with state of the art CGI animation. As the DVD proclaims, Return to the Jungle has headache inducing visuals that look like test animation from the early days of the PlayStation. In the film, Kong is captured by an evil hunter who plans to put Kong and the dinosaur of the Kong Island in a special zoo, and it is up to Kong's friend Jason, Kibrimoro, Tan, Scout McNeil, and Loa Saffron Henderson to rescue him. Even as a franchise compliment niches, this was dire, but you are in luck. So are the next two. The missing element of King Kong 1933 was that it was not a musical. You say, well, 1998's The Mighty Kong solves that. The direct to video animated film is essentially a rapidly paced, poorly edited remake of the original movie starring Dudley Moore in his final role as Carl Denham. You might suppose it was made for kids, and I guess that was the intention, only it's so boring, so focused on the weirdly mature romance between Anne and Jack, while also being overly silly that it is not clear who was this made for. There is a clearly an aim to draw in the Disney crowd, with Jodie voicing and Anne and the Sherman brothers. The Jungle Book: The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, Mary Poppins. Writing the songs, but there's not an airborne in the bunch. Oh, and the Kong falls from the Empire State Building and lives forever trapped in this musical misery. The first follow up to the Kong, the animated series, is blissfully not made with state of the art CGI animation and instead just traditional hand drawn animation. Kong, who is not the original Kong but a clone whose DNA was stabilized with the DNA of his human brother, Jason, struggles to protect Kong Island from the threat of raising Atlantis. The concept of Kong being manipulated by a snake woman scourges to replace the world above with the fabled sunken, one of the kind of Edgar Rice, Robert E. Howard esque storytelling Kong could thrive in. But alas, the pupilness is overridden by shallow storytelling and, if you can believe it, Musical numbers. Again, the song here largely rely on nonsensical rhyming and the repeated refrain that pad the film's runtime to an hour and 9 minutes with 25 minutes would not have suffocated. We have made it out of the animated era of Kong to arrive at, well, a live action film that frankly is not much better. The sequel to King Kong, 1976, King Kong Lives, bring back director John Gullimer for a dull affair that finds Kong alive after his fall from the World Trade Center and in need of a heart transplant. How does a giant ape get a heart transplant? Well, scientists led by Dr. Amy Franklin, Linda Hamilton engineer an artificial one. But there's not enough blood to keep it pumping. So adventurer Hank Mitchell, Brain Carven, returns to the mysterious island from previous film and finds a female Kong and captures her. Just like that, dubbed Lady Kong, the female ape takes part in a successful blood transfusion before she and Kong escape from the lab where they are pursued by the army led by the mustache twirling Lt. Colonel Lieutenant Colonel Archie Neb, John Ashton. While it finally seems like there might be some excitement in store, it's largely a bore, undercut by frequent attempts at comedy. How does one make giant apes facing the military boring, despite explosions and primate bloodshed? For a film that was intended to be an emotional romance, the only thing moving about King Kong lives is the restlessness your body goes through while watching it. The latest entry in legendary Monsterverse once again brings Kong and Godzilla together, but this time as allies instead of enemies. Much like Adam Wingard's previous film, GVK, the movie is far more interested in monster fights than human characters. Some of the fights are cool, while others are a bit wild with the camera movement, making it difficult to track where the creatures are battling. There are large swaths of the film that take place in the Hollow Earth, where the human characters Dr. Andrew, Rebecca Hall, Bernie, Brain Tyree Henry, Trapper, Dan Steven, and Gia, Kylie Hotley are absent, and Kong and his companion might as well have been gorilla sized, robbing the film of the human perspective needed to given the Titan scale. And when humans do become the focus, they largely exit to either provide exposition or relief. While there are elements of what could have been a strong Kong movie, including his findings a surrogate son in Suko, GXK shoves Godzilla into the mix, where he does not do much other than the undercut the drama in Kong's fight against the villainous giant primate Scar King, who even with his captives Kaijo, the ice-breathing Shimo, is not a threat big enough to require the team up between the two in first place. Following Toho's hit King Kong vs. Godzilla 1962, Toho partnered with the then current owner of Kong, Rankin Bass, and director Ishiro Honda to develop a film loosely based on Rankin Bass's cartoon series. The King Kong Show. The result is weird, albeit fun, mismatch of genre that sees evil Bond villain inspired Doctor Who Heidi Amando building Mikai Kong of the sole purpose of excavating a site in the North Pole where the radioactive element X is hidden. Mechanic Kong fails and Doctor Who decides no imitator will suffice. He needs the real Kong. Hypnotized, Kong does Doctor Who's bidding until Kong's latest human love interest, Lieutenant Susan Watson, Linda Jo Miller, breaks him out of his trance just in time for a showdown with Mechanicon. The plot is simple, but there's still so fun to be had with this entry. Originally, Toho had planned for Abira Horror of the Deep 1966 to be a Kong installment as well, but after disagreement over the choice of director, Rankin Bass dropped out. The Horror of the Deep became a Godzilla film, though it still feels very much like a Kong film. The fourth entry in Legendary's Monsterverse series bring the two titans together again for the first time in nearly 60 years. Wingard's film focuses heavily on the monster fight but loses the humanity and thematic reckoning with the continued effects of nuclear power on the environment of the modern world that defined the previous three entries. Yes, the fight between Godzilla and Kong are fun to watch, but there's a lack of awe as a result of the majority of the human cast being sidelined or cut out of the film entirely. Where is Jessica Henwick? Madison Russell, Millie Bobby Brown does not get any character development, and the new character introduced, like Nathan Lynn, Alexander Skarsgård, and Lillian Andrew, Rebecca Hall, are sapphire. Some subplots so go nowhere, and characters like Ran Swerzwa, Sean Augie are not even connected to very obvious threads from the previous films that would have added some layers. It is a film cut to pieces in post production, and none of it amounts to anything more than big monsters crash, bang, crash, which can be entertaining for a while, but it does not feel in tune with Monster vs. as it previously existed. The third Kong installment and the third Godzilla installment saw the icons come to blow. The result was the most attended Godzilla film in Japan until Godzilla Minus One 2023, when a pharmaceutical company captures Kong to use as their spokes ape until Godzilla awakens and free himself from an iceberg. At that point, the Japanese military decides to use Kong as a weapon against Godzilla. Despite Godzilla being on his home turf, the giant reptile was still a villain at this point in the franchise. So, despite being an American creation, he triumphs over Godzilla. The battle includes the famous scene turned meme in which Kong shoves a tree trunk first down Godzilla's throat, but battle aside, there is some great significance to the film in how it explored the pharmaceutical communism through exploitation and dehumanization. The film also launched the popular Godzilla vs. formula, which carried the Toho Productions well into the 21st century, released just 9 months after the sensation of King Kong. Son of Kong is a much lighter film, running at just 69 minutes, and was made as a cash grab. Despite that, director Ernest B. Skolnick manages to deliver a very entertaining B-movie that follows Kong's offspring along with publicly despised Carl Denham, Robert Armstrong, with the threat of prison looming over them. Denham and Captain Englehorn, Frank Richard, make for the seas and pick up Trove Hilda Helen Mackey and the rumor of buried treasure on Skull Island along the way. Upon his return to Skull Island, Denham befriends a giant albino ape whom he dubs Little Kong. The film is pulpier than the original, showcasing Little Kong's fight against the island's dinosaurs and a massive cave bear. But there is something charming about Denham's relationship with him, and the film serves as a bit of redemption for the infamous promoter. Despite its hasty production, Son of Kong does not miss a step in its stop motion effects, and much like the original King Kong, Son of Kong was also an influence on Peter Jackson, who owns one of the two existing Little Kong models. The second installment in the MonsterVerse, directed by Jordan Vogt Roberts, takes Kong back to a time before he was king and was just a little fella. Okay, so no little exactly, but smaller and younger than the Kong we have come to know in current entries. Vogt Roberts populates Skull Island with strange creatures, including the skull crawler and an entire ecosystem of giant monsters, tackling the film with a monster lover's glee. But alongside these impressive creations, the film does not refrain from a semi serious consideration of Vietnam vets sent to explore the island while still carrying the war with them. Though it contains plenty of visual reference to apocalypses, now it never goes that deep or dark. Not that it is necessarily needed to, but the only major flaw of the film is that the tone is not entirely consistent, but it does enough to provide an emotional connection to some of the characters, namely Soldier James Conrad, Tom Hiddleston, anti-war photographer Mason Weaver, Brie Larson, Army Lieutenant Colonel Preston Packard, Samuel Lieutenant Jackson, and Hank Madlow, John C. Reilly, who survived on the island after crashing during World War II. The film also makes great strides in its portrayal of the island's indigenous people who are protected by Kong. Also, Larry Fong's cinematography makes for some of the most striking images in the Kong's cinematic history. The first remake of King Kong is the first Kong movie I had experience of seeing, and thus I have particular fondness for it. One that holds up upon rewatch, starring Jeff Bridges, Jessica Lange, and Charles Grodin. King Kong sails on the talent of its cast, along with the effects by Carlo Rambaldi and Rick Baker. While it does not quite evoke the horror or thrills of the original film, it makes up for it with a sweeping romantic adventure that could have only been made in the 70s. When Petrox Oil Company Texas Fred Wilson Gordon discovers evidence of an oil deposit on a mysterious island. He plans an expedition to the island, despite the warning of paleontologist Jack Prescott Bridges, who had heard legends of the island's many dangers. After discovering an actress on raft, Duane Lange, the only survivor of the yacht that exploded, Prescott has all the more reasons to stay. The journey to the island does not deliver on the promise of oil, but there is a great power there. Behind the giant wall built by a tribe of indigenous people lives Kong, refusing to come back to the States empty handed. Wilson decides to capture Kong. Interestingly enough, Guillermo's film borrows a key narrative element of King Kong versus Godzilla. This time, instead of Kong being used as an advertisement for a pharmaceutical company, he is the price of big oil who uses him as a crown clad mascot, mockingly named King Kong. With charming chemistry between Bridges and Lane, the theatrics of Gordon, and a showstopper of a third act that is wildly bloodily. King Kong succeeded as both a remake of timeless story and it is a time capsule of period defined by gas shortage, a president invested in big oil and continued exploitation of the resources of stolen land. King Kong not only changed cinema, it made giant monsters a staple of our media. inspiring the creation of Godzilla, Mothra, Dam, Cloverfield, Pacific Rim, and on the list goes. Considered to be one of the cinema's greatest achievement and technical marvel that proved revolutionary for stop motion and matte paintings, rear screen projection, and miniatures. There's not a genre film in existence that does not owe something to King Kong. Directed by Marion C. Cooper and Ernest P. Skostak, King Kong follows documentarian Carl Denham, Robert Armstrong, who has his light set on a new film, shoot as a far and exotic locations. After hiring struggling actresses Ann Darrow, Faye Warre, Denham sets off the ship. The venture, along with the captain, Englehorn, Frank Richer, and his first mate, Jack Driscoll, Bruce Cabot, to Skull Island, where they meet an indigenous tribe who decides to sacrifice Anne to their god, King, leading to Fairware's iconic scream. Denham, Jack, and several crew members search for Anne on the island, encountering dinosaurs and all manners of extinct life forms. Dated as some of the effects are now, the film still feels thrilling and the narrative so involving that we invite a suspension of belief so that we might believe in the magic of what's on screen, just like the audiences of 1933. By the time we arrive at the iconic ending of Kong atop the Empire State Building, and clutched in his hand as the biplanes swarm him. It is nearly impossible not to feel compassion for this monster, to project our humanity onto this model figure and turn him real, while we submit to the chills that take over when Denham offers the film's final tragic statement. No, it wasn't the airplanes, it was beauty killed the beast. No, it is not as influential nor revolutionary as the 1930s film, but Peter Jackson's King Kong is a giant beating heart that's not only a love letter to the original film, but the everything that made Peter Jackson the director Peter Jackson. The horror, the fantasy, and the imaginary world and theatric consideration of love. The Lord of Rings trilogy is his magnum opus, but King Kong feels like his most personal film, his gift to the 9-year-old boy he once was, whose life was changed by seeing the 1933 film. Jackson had worked towards this film since 1996, and you could almost call it obsession, not unlike Carl Denham, Jack Black, to deliver something on scale the world had never seen, but also something definitive to his journey as an artist, as the most expensive movie ever made at that time. It is one of those ambitious swings where a director puts the entirety of himself on display and you can feel it in every frame. The plot follows the same beats as 1933 film, but Jackson finds numerous places to expand on the character, their relationship, and the world of Skull Island, all backed by Andrew Lansing's rich cinematography, composer James Newton Howard's enthralling score, and the epic and emotional storytelling of co-writers Fran Walsh and Ophelia Boyens. When I saw it, I felt something akin to what audiences felt watching The Wizard of Oz 1939 for the first time, like stepping out of the real world and into one of the pure imagination, a land of endless discoveries where every monster kid could find something to captivate. Dinosaurs, giant insects, hidden temples, and Kong Andy Serkis himself. Kong's relationship with Anne Naomi Watts contained a kind of lyrical beauty compared to her more practical, though none less engaging, romance with Jack Adrien Brody. There's an ice skating scene between Anne and Kong before the climax of the film, and knowingly the tragedy to come. It is one of the most heartbreaking scenes in 21st century cinema. As far as remakes go, this is one that not only expands on the original in some exciting ways, but it gives audiences better insight into the filmmaker. Another review says King Kong, landmark American monster, film released in 1933 that was noted for its pioneering special effects by Willis O'Brien. It was the first significant feature film to star an animated character and also made actresses Faye an international star. Directed Carl Denham, played by Robert Armstrong, leads a film crew to a remote, uncharted Pacific island in search of legendary Kong, a gigantic ape. After the island's inhabitant abandons actresses and Dario Barre to Kong, Denham and his crew pursue the beast through the dinosaur-infested jungle. They eventually capture Kong and take him to the New York as a sideshow attraction with disastrous result. The climax of the film, when Kong climbs the Empire State Building while clutching a terrified Anne, is one of the most famous in the film history. Kong safely placed Anne aside and then battles machine gunfire from the swarming planes, which mortally wounded him and caused him to plunge to his death. Denham then utters the film's signature lines. Oh no, it was not the planes, it was beauty killed the beast. Despite the perception of Kong as a giant ferocious beast, the eighth world of wonder of the world, as he was billed in the script and in publicity material for the film, he was in fact an 18 inches 45 centimeter puppet designed by O'Brien for close-up shots. The special effects team built giant arms, hands, and feet for Kong, and man inside giant model head of the ape operated cables and levers to stimulate facial features. O'Brien's pioneering use of the model and miniature stop motion animation, miniature rear projection, and traveling matters, which combine images and foreground action with a separately filmed background, become the basic technique of movie special effect. Until her death in 2004, Ray enjoyed an iconic status in Hollywood based solely upon her role in this film. Max Steiner's triumphant musical score inspired a generation of the film composers. King Kong was remade in 1976 with Jeff Bridges and Jessica Lange in 2005 by director Peter Jackson. Review 3. People often say our current superhero movies are modern day mythology, but nothing to come out of Hollywood deserves that title quite like King Kong. The story of a giant ape stolen from his unspoiled island home hit audiences at the deep, primal level of great myths. It's a thematically rich as any of them. It could be as simple Beauty and Beast story as the dialogue claims, or it could be a story of untamed masculine aggression and a desire of environmental destruction of indigenous life doomed by the march of Western civilization, of an incrustable, worthful god reduced to morality. The story of King Kong has been subject to multiple retelling and reinterpretation as a stop motion model, a man in suit, a man in motion capture suit.
and most recently, the challenger in blockbuster rematch with the other greatest movie monster of all time, Godzilla. How did we get here? King Kong. Maybe the spray for his age, but he's lived a long time, over 90 years from his birth in the mind of Marion C. Cooper to the release of Godzilla vs. King. And he stayed busy all that time, living a long, complicated life we have distilled for you here. Kong's creation. Many hands brought Kong to life, but it all began with Marion C. Cooper. As outlandish as the movie's story of Lost Island and daring adventure may seem, it's not too far from Cooper's own life. In Kong, the history of a movie icon from Faye Wray to Peter Jackson, Ray Morton chronicles the director's career in what Cooper called natural drama, documentaries filmed all over the world, then reshoot and recut into narrative form. Even the seemingly inexplainable presence of the movie starlet on a documentary show came from the real life. Screenwriter Ruth Rose based the fictional film Carl Denham monologue about how every critic and exhibitor demands a love story on Cooper's own compliments. The discovery of Komodo dragon, a huge primitive reptile that had long been thought extinct, fired Cooper's imagination. He conceived a new natural drama about a war between Komodo dragon and a clan of gorillas, eventually whittled down to just one great ape. When Cooper learned the dragons he'd shipped over from Komodo died in captivity, he found his tragic ending. Cooper commissioned a script from mystery writer Edgar Wells about a big game hunter who meets a rowboat full of escaped convicts and a lost island. James Kretschmann rewrote it, replacing the hunter with a Cooper-esque filmmaker. But the studio RKO balked at the cost of filming live animals in their natural habitat. Fortunately, they were also filming a never finished movie called Creation, featuring stop motion dinosaurs created by the great Willis O'Brien, and Cooper found the man to bring the Kong to life. The original Kong. In its final form, the original King Kong tells the story of Carl Denham, Robert Armstrong, a filmmaker who journeys to a mysterious island to document the legends of god-like ape, with down on her luck actress Ann Darrow Favorite in tow. In landing, they interrupt a sacrifice to Kong, and Anne finds herself on the altar. Denham's crew fights their way across the island and its prehistoric beasts, finally bringing Kong back to the New York. He escapes, of course, and drags Anne up to the newly built Empire State Building, then the tallest building on Earth, until a fleet of fighter pilots shoot him down. Co-director Ernest Schoedsack was horrified to discover he could see the ways Will's O'Brien team distributed Kong's hair as it jumped around between frames. Morton wrote that he thought the whole project was sunk until an RKO executive enthusiastically responded, "Look, Kong is angry. His fur is bristling. It is the ultimate problematic fave. The inhabitants of Skull Island are hideously stereotyped, and even Kong himself draws parallel to racist fear of ape-like black men stealing white women. But despite this and all the other faults, it still retains a primal power no other movie can compare to. As much as Cooper and O'Brien, the credit goes to Max Steiner for his plus-pounding music, but RKO were too cheap to commission a score and only paid Steiner a patch together existing music. Cooper paid him out of the pocket for an original composition. Money well spent.